January 13th, 2022. The time is now 3:31. This meeting is being conducted pursuant to the provisions of Government Code Section 54953, Subdivision E, and the recommendation of the Ventura County Public Health Officer issued September 21st, 2021, parentheses, social distancing recommendation, as determined by the City Council on December 20th, 2021. So at this point, can we call the meeting to order? I guess please stand and we'll do the flag salute. I pledge allegiance to the flag of the United States of America and to the republic for which it stands, one nation under God, indivisible, with liberty and justice for all. Okay, at this point in time, Madam Clerk, can you do roll call?
Councilmember Gama?
Sí, yo estoy aquí.
Thank you, sir.
Spanish.
Councilmember Hernandez? Oh, you're muted, ma'am.
Laura,
We see
you're
that you're
muted.
Oh, I guess my space key isn't working here. Thank you.
Councilmember Perez?
Here.
Mayor Pro Tem Martinez?
Present.
And Mayor Rollins?
Here.
All present.
Okay, so we have two business items to discuss today. Or we're going to have the number one is our mandatory AB 1234 Ethics and Brown Act training. And business item two is the Rosenberg Rules of Order, County Policy Manual, and Efficient Meeting Protocol. At this time, I would like to call on our city attorney, Kevin Spalding to take it from there.
Thank you, Mayor Rollins. I'm going to share my screen here, and we have quite a bit of material to get through tonight. I think we're sitting at about 127 slides. So I will try to make it somewhat interesting. Give me one moment.
We're all excited.
All right. Can you guys see my screen?
Not yet.
We can see your
I am.
smiling face.
All right. There we go. There's the screen. And here we are. Okay. So many of you remember our AB 1234 training. I believe the last time we did it was approximately a year, maybe a little bit more, when council members Perez and Mayor Pro Tem Martinez were onboarded following the general election. Since that time, there has been a significant amount of changes to the regulations instituted by the FPPC. Most recently, I believe last week, they were amending and finalizing the rules regarding behested payments. So it's important to remember that as we go through this training, the purpose of it is to familiarize you with the laws that govern your service and when to ask questions. It's important to keep in mind that this area of law is incredibly robust. The Political Reform Act is quite large and covers a number of areas. And it's always important when you're in doubt to ask questions, either of myself or probably more appropriately of the FPPC, since I have to caution you that reliance upon my advice will not immunize you from an FPPC enforcement action. Another purpose of this training is to encourage you to think beyond legal restrictions and provide the tools for doing so. And of course, we're doing this so that we comply with the AB 1234 requirements, which require a 2-hour session, and you have to recertify every 2 years. AB 1234 requires specific content to be discussed, and as I mentioned before, its focus is more on breadth than depth. So it ends up being that we discuss a wide variety of topics, and we don't go too deep onto each of them. Mainly the focus is to let each of you know when it might be appropriate to have questions. With respect to this presentation, I will ask you to not interrupt and ask questions because, like I said, we have a ton of material to get through and a very limited time to do it. I will stop after subdivisions of the Political Reform Act and certain things to request if there are any questions. Otherwise, I cannot see the Zoom meeting as I'm sharing my screen, so it would be appropriate to interrupt when I ask for questions. In addition, the city clerk, Ms. Buckskemper, will be circulating completion certificates to the council members that you can keep for your records following this meeting. So what is ethics anyway? Ethics is what we ought to do, and ethics laws are what we must do. They set the minimum standards. So frequently in law, what we see is regulations setting a floor, not a ceiling. The Political Reform Act, as well as the FPPC regulations, impose their own penalties, and legal does not necessarily mean ethical. So just because something is legal doesn't mean it's the right course of action or what we ought to do or must do. These concepts apply to you because as a public official, you've been selected to act on behalf of the public in some areas of public interest because the trust and confidence the public has placed in you that you will act in their best interest. You are representatives and stewards of the public trust, and as a result, the public has a vested interest in making sure that decisions are made free from financial conflicts of interest or impermissible bias, which is really what the heart of the Political Reform Act is. So among these duties and obligations are a duty of diligence. Each council member has a duty to do a good job by using your particular set of skills and acting with due care, reading the reports, preparing for meetings, attending meetings, engaging on behalf of your constituency. There is also a duty of responsibility. This duty is to be loyal to the public by not putting your own political or financial interests ahead of the public interest. This is more like a fiduciary responsibility that we see in corporate law and we see in agency law. And in addition, the Political Reform Act prohibits an elected official or even an appointed official from using their official position to enhance self-image or financial wealth. There's also a duty of honesty, and that is to be open and transparent and truthful, which is usually governed by the Brown Act and the Public Records Act. So why you should take the time to do this? Well, the law requires it every 2 years. In addition, you want to protect yourself from violations of this. As I said, these regulations are forever changing. During the pandemic, the FPPC has really gone into overdrive in promoting and promulgating regulations. There's been a lot of changes, probably 2 or 3 times a week. I get notice from the FPPC about notice of proposed rulemaking. So these are changing frequently. And in all honesty, during the pandemic, the way that elected officials behave are different. The way that I think I read today that behested payments went from about 700,000 annually to 225 million in the last year. And so kind of the way that we're funding things, the way that we're making political donations and the way that we're behaving is changing frequently. And so it's important that we talk about these items so that we know when to ask questions to avoid getting into trouble. These violations can have significant penalties. So they can have jail time anywhere from 6 months to 5 years, and there can be fines of up to $100,000 restitution and forfeiture. In addition, many of these provisions require you to pay attorney's fees if you are the non-prevailing party. And there are personal costs to this, let alone damage to reputation, as well as damage in the public's confidence in local government. So the general ethical principles are that you should not realize a personal financial gain as a result of your public service. You shouldn't take advantage of personal advantages or perks. The public is entitled to transparency and fair process in the way that the government operates. So no personal financial gain. What we're really talking about is the possibility of personal financial gain or loss must not be factors considered in the public decision-making arena. For many of you, we'll get to this later, but you're familiar with the Form 700 in which you disclose all of your personal finances so that the public is aware of what things might affect personal financial matters. So we're familiar with a lot of these personal financial gain laws as they relate to public service. Everybody knows what bribery is and quid pro quo arrangements. That's actually a crime. It can be a felony. It's governed by Penal Code Section 68. And then there's financial conflicts of interest under the Political Reform Act, which is really the subject of what we're talking about here. There are also prohibited contracts, which are contractual conflict of interest. Those are governed by Government Code Section 1090, and there will be a section on that. There are campaign contributions governed by Government Code Section 84308, which is part of the Political Reform Act. And then there's leaving public office or employment. A lot of these are revolving door policies, and they They affect whether or not an official leaving a position can come back and argue in front of that agency for money. And we'll talk about that as well. So bribery, it is a crime to receive, offer, or agree to receive anything of monetary value with the understanding that you will act in an official way, one way or the other on a particular matter. As we said earlier, this is the type of quid pro quo arrangement. I scratch your back, you scratch mine. So examples of this are a free trip to Hawaii offered in exchange for approval of a resort hotel or a development agreement for same, or an offer of free cannabis in exchange for approval of a medical cannabis dispensary. These type of agreements, we've seen them recently with, in particular, the cannabis one with respect to land use decisions in the city of Hesperia. The FBI, I believe, arrested the mayor as well as the city manager out there. And so these things do, a lot of this is city of Bell type corruption and stuff like that. So even when we think about this as kind of being somewhat ridiculous examples, they happen from time to time, and it's important to recognize the damage they do to the community. The city of Bell will probably forever be known as one of the most corrupt cities in California as a result of what happened there. Violations and penalties for bribery are jail time of 2 to 4 years. Typically, you have to disgorge the amount of the bribe. There's a restitution fine of $2,000 to $10,000. There can be forfeiture of office with a lifetime ban of ever holding public office again. And these things do come up from time to time. So it's important to be aware of that. Financial conflicts of interest under the Political Reform Act is essentially no public official shall make, participate in making, or use his or her official position to influence any governmental decision in which he or she knows or has reason to know he or she has a disqualifying financial interest. An official has a disqualifying interest if the decision will have a reasonably foreseeable material financial effect, distinguishable from the effect on the public generally, directly on the official, the official's immediate family, or any of the official's financial interests. So as I said before, the reason we file a Form 700 is so that the public has the ability to verify that officials are not making decisions that directly affect their financial interests. So a number of these potentially disqualifying financial interests under the Political Reform Act are an interest in business entities. Usually that's when an official is a director, officer, partner, trustee, employee, or holds any position in the management of a business entity. In addition, business interests or investment worth $2,000 or more, even if it's a direct or indirect investment. The distinction between indirect investments really are those owned by the individuals or the official's spouse or dependent child, by agents, or by business entities or trusts in which the official or agent spouse or dependent child has at least a 10% interest. So if you were part of a company, had a 10% interest in part of a holding company that operated another business in which the city was going to engage into a contract, that would be the type of business interest or investment that we're concerned about. And then the one that we're all most familiar with is interests in real property. And so including leaseholds, in which any interest in real property in which there's a direct or indirect interest of $2,000 or more with month-to-month tenancies excluded. And so most of the time when we're seeing any recusals based on conflict of interest or Political Reform Act, it usually has to do with an interest in real property within the city limits. In addition, sources of income can actually become disqualifying. Any person or entity from whom the official receives income of $500 or more, including promised income within 12 months prior to the decision. This includes personal loans, commissions, officials' community property interest in a spouse's income, etc. Donor or source of gift can create problems under certain circumstances, and that is any person or entity, including their intermediaries, from whom the official received gifts totaling $520 or more in 12 months prior to a decision. These sort of things tend to come up when we're looking at campaign contributions and the city council is acting as a planning commission or a planning commissioner received in those jurisdictions where planning commission is elected or appointed. And they received a campaign contribution, so to speak, or a donation 12 months prior to a land use decision coming up. These sorts of things would require recusal. Personal finances. These interests tend to exist when the decision will measurably increase or decrease the personal expenses, income, assets, or liabilities of the official or his or her immediate family, unless they are nominal or inconsequential, or the public generally exception applies. A lot of the times when we look at things like this, I find it easier to think of rezoning a rental property's zoning to disallow short-term rentals. If an elected official owned that property, that zoning decision would certainly have a material effect on income based on its status as a rental property. And so that would be something that the public would want to know before the decision is rendered. So the FPPC proposes a 4-part test for determining financial conflicts. Typically, the first question to ask is it reasonably foreseeable that the decision will have a financial effect on the official's financial interest in any way? Basically, what we're looking for is that this isn't some hypothetical or distant kind of theoretical way that it could have an effect. Is it reasonably foreseeable? Could it possibly happen in any real world situation? If the answer to that is yes, then we say, will the reasonably foreseeable financial effect be material? Materiality is a standard where we're really looking at how, we'll get into some of these a little bit more in depth as it pertains to real property. But what we're really looking at is how likely is this effect going to influence an official's decision? What's the weight of it, so to speak? Can the official show that the material financial effect on the official's financial interest is indistinguishable from its effect on the public generally? We typically refer to this as the public generally exception. It can allow for an otherwise conflicted council member or elected official to take a vote on an action, but it should be used sparingly. It doesn't apply in most circumstances. And then we have, despite a conflict of interest, do situations exist that may nevertheless permit the official to participate? This is usually what we refer to as legally required participation, and this requires an FPPC advice letter and determination. It is exceedingly rare and only happens in very rare occasions. So step one, okay, is it reasonably foreseeable that this will have a financial effect on any of the official's financial interests? And we talked about this a little bit. It might realistically happen, or is it too remote a possibility? One of the best ways to do this is to determine whether or not financial interest is explicitly or not explicitly involved. If it's not reasonably foreseeable that there will be any financial benefit or detriment to the official, then the inquiry ends. We say there's no conflict because it's not reasonably foreseeable. If, however, the interest is explicitly involved, so let's say that it's a decision about keeping it in the real property example. Let's say it's a decision about granting a conditional use permit for an official's property. Well, the official's property is the subject of the decision, so it's pretty clear that it's going to have a reasonably material financial effect. Not explicitly involved is, let's say, street sweeping operations around an official's house. We're not talking directly about the house, but we're talking about something that could affect it. And that being said, that's kind of where we're at for is it a remote possibility or could it realistically happen? So I kind of went through this already. The explicitly involved reasonable foreseeability is presumed if the interest is the subject of the action. So issuance or revocation or denial of any permit, license, entitlement, or contract with the official's financial interest. Certain decisions affecting real property, like we spoke about before. But what we're really looking for is the official's interest the object or subject of the actual decision? If so, reasonable foreseeability is presumed. If it's not explicitly involved or it's indirect, so to speak, it may still reasonably be foreseeable if it can be recognized as a realistic possibility, but more than a hypothetical or theoretical possibility. The financial effect will not be reasonably foreseeable if the result cannot be expected absent extraordinary circumstances beyond the official's control. This is an important distinction because, as you can see, this follows along a continuum. How far remote of an interest are we talking? And it really comes down to, these analyses are very fact specific. It's difficult to give black and white answers when it comes to the Political Reform Act, because they're all just so fact specific and what a reasonable person would foresee at the right time and whatnot. So a general rule of thumb is that if you are at all uncomfortable about the decision or something about the decision makes you uncomfortable, there's no harm in recusing yourself. There's more harm in saying, I don't think that's remote enough without an FPPC advice letter and moving forward anyway, and then finding yourself subject to an FPPC action. So if it's not explicitly involved, there are some factors that are given to us in Regulation 18701B to determine if reasonable foreseeability exists. So we look upon whether or not there are intervening events. So for example, are there other things that have to happen for any effect to be realized? If there are, how many? How likely is it that those things would happen? In addition, whether the official should anticipate a financial effect on his or her financial interest as a potential outcome under normal circumstances when using appropriate due diligence and care. This looks like the reasonable person standard to me. This is, would a person in the official's position realize that in normal circumstances, they would likely see some benefit or detriment with respect to their financial interest? If the answer to that is yes, then it's reasonably foreseeable. And whether a reasonable inference can be made that the financial effects on the decision on the official's financial interest might compromise his or her ability to act in a manner consistent with his or her duty to act in the interests of the public. So there are additional factors, but like I said, the focus is really on temptation here. When we get into materiality, we'll talk about how strong is that temptation? What's the weight of it? And so if the financial effect is reasonably foreseeable, we move to step 2. So here's where we talk about financial effect materiality. And so material can be defined as it's financially important enough to trigger a conflict. So different materiality standards apply to each financial interest shown on slides 14 and 15. There's an ethics training guide that I'll forward to each of you following this meeting. It is a public record, so if anybody out there is watching wants to see it, I'd be happy to present it. There are still some things, as I said, that might be outdated in it, just given the fact that the FPPC, even as early as this week, has adopted final rules or interim final rules on some of these subjects. However, for purposes of time and clarity today, and because it's often the most identified conflict, we're going to look at real property ownership interests under the materiality standards today, and any financial conflicts there. And as you can see, this year even that standard was significantly revised, and now I've got to figure out how to go back. All right. Let's get back here. All right, back to where we are. So in today's example, we're going to follow real property ownership, and leaseholds. So in the next few slides, we're going to demonstrate materiality standards with respect to these. The caveat that I have to throw out there is that this listing is not exhaustive. There are various exceptions, and there are other considerations that apply, notwithstanding these things are constantly fluid and incredibly fact specific. So generally, if we get to step 2 and we find that the interest is not material, then we'll move on to step 3. But for now, decisions have a material financial effect on an official's real property when they involve adoption or amendment of a development criteria applicable to the official's parcel. Let's say a change in zoning that allows second-story additions. Determine zoning or rezoning, annexation or de-annexation of the official's parcel. Impose, repeal, or modify any taxes, fees, or assessments applicable to the official's parcel. Whether they involve issuance, denial, or revocation of licenses, permits, or entitlements for the official's parcel. Or whether they involve construction of or improvements to streets, water, sewer, storm drainage, or similar facilities if the official's parcel benefits differently from other parcels similarly situated. So these decisions also have a material financial effect on an official's real property interests, except leaseholds, when they authorize the sale, purchase, or lease of the official's parcel, when they involve property located 500 feet or less from the official's parcel, unless there is clear and convincing evidence that the decision will not have any measurable impact on the official's parcel. Clear and convincing evidence requires a finding of very high probability. So we're looking at more than 75% likely. In addition, when these decisions involve property located more than 500 feet, but less than 1,000 feet from the official's parcel, And they would change the official's parcel's development or income producing potential, market value, highest and best use, or character by substantially altering traffic levels, intensity of use, view, privacy, noise level, parking, or air quality. In addition, with respect to that last one, it's presumed that there is no materiality if the decision is 1,000 feet outside of an official's parcel or outside of that 1,000-foot radius that we've drawn. However, clear and convincing evidence can be brought forward to rebut the same. So even if something is 2,000 feet away, if there is clear and convincing evidence that the official's parcel will be benefited or harmed, then it's still a material conflict because we're still concerned about whether or not the decision or the financial interest would affect the elected official's decision-making ability. So moving along and talking about leasehold interests. These material financial effects on leaseholds apply only if the decision changes the lease termination date, increases or decreases potential rental value of the property, changes the official's actual or legally allowable use of the property, or impacts officials' use and enjoyment of the property. And you may remember from a few slides ago, these rules do not apply to month-to-month tenancies just because there is no long-term financial interest with respect to those arrangements. So decisions involving property located more than 1,000 feet from official's parcel, we discussed this already, are presumed not to have a material financial effect, but this presumption may be rebutted with clear and convincing evidence to the contrary. Decisions involving this FVPC regulation also will not have a financial effect on officials' real property, including those which solely concern repairs, replacement, or maintenance of existing streets, water, sewer, storm drainage, or similar facilities. So this is one of those circumstances where it's kind of a statutory exemption based on the public generally exception. But the real key here is that they have to only be repairs, replacement, or maintenance, not improvements on existing facilities. If the facilities are non-existing or it's an improvement, this will not apply. In addition, when those decisions solely concern adoption amendment of a general plan and all conditions listed in subdivisions A through D of 18702.2 are met. So I haven't listed A through D out, but they are extensive and whatnot. Generally, it's fairly easy to meet those requirements with respect to a general plan adoption, because there is no real land use change that goes along with general plan. It simply makes the potential for one down the road. So if we go through step 1 and step 2 and we determine that there is a reasonably foreseeable financial effect and that effect is material, then the official should recuse and abstain from voting. However, when we get into step 3, we can start looking at reasons why, for some other reason, it's still legal or ethical for the official to engage in that discussion or vote or use an official position to influence the outcome of same. So what we're really looking for with respect to step 3 is what I've continually referred to as the public generally exception. And what that is can the official show that the material financial effect on the financial interest is indistinguishable from the effect on the public generally? And so in order to prove this, you have to establish that a significant segment of the public is affected, and that is greater than or equal to 25% of all businesses, real property, or individuals in a jurisdiction, or 15% of all residential properties if the interest is in the official's primary residence. And the effect on his or her financial interest is not unique when compared to the effect on this significant segment. So unique effect also includes disproportionate impacts and typically assessments, taxes, and fees and things of that nature, which are applied equally and uniformly. We don't run into this issue too much, or we can say that the public generally exception applies because everybody in this area are paying their full fair share, and assessments or parcel taxes are applied equally. And so, but the significant segment aspect of this public generally exception was recently modified. I believe this is last year's with the greater than 25% of all businesses. It was increased from the year before that. And if the trends with the FVPC are continuing, we can probably expect to see this going all the way up to 50% at some point in the near future. There's a political push to get rid of this exception. In my opinion, it keeps getting more expansive. So a caveat here, specific and complex standards are involved in implying this exception. Never assume this exception applies. The public official has the burden of proof in any FPPC enforcement action. Reliance on the advice of counsel is not an adequate defense to an FPPC enforcement action. So it's always best to seek consultation from the FPPC itself. And if this exception applies, there simply is no conflict of interest. So you'll hear me throughout this presentation kind of reiterate that all of these are very fact specific. Reliance on my advice will not save you. And the FPPC is really the only agency that's capable of giving advice on this that you could rely upon if they decided to come after you in illegal enforcement. And so frequently if it's a close question and you cannot recuse or abstain based on any of these financial interests, it's usually best to seek an FPPC determination letter and then rely on whatever happens with the FPPC. If this section does not apply, then we move on to the final step, which is step 4, which is where we start talking about that despite a conflict of interest, are there situations that will permit the official to participate? And so we get into 2 of these things. One is legally required participation, and this applies in very specific circumstances when the government agency would be paralyzed or unable to act. Where I've seen this apply before in the past is when we have the present and voting rule, which we'll get to later, that many of you are familiar with. It's where we have, let's say we have 3 abstaining city council members, and based on a financial conflict of interest, and whatever the decision is requires a supermajority. So we have 5 present for the purposes of a quorum, and 2 would only give us a majority. We would not be able to get, or let's say it was split 50-50, 50% does not get us to a supermajority. So in essence, the decision, let's say it was an obligation to pay back bonds or something like that, the decision could not be made unless somebody else participates and they get to that vote. As you can see from my kind of makeshift example, this happens incredibly rarely. I've never seen it actually authorized by the FPPC. I've seen it attempted. I've seen the FPPC enforce it. It's just typically something that we don't wish to do. The second scenario is whether or not segmentation of the decision is possible. And we've seen this with respect to some of our conflicts of interest. Is certain decisions can be broken up into smaller decisions, separated from a larger one, so that otherwise conflicted council members can vote on certain decisions, which is why sometimes we end up with a vote with respect to certain non-law enforcement employees versus law enforcement or sworn officer employees, as a result of trying to segment any potential conflicts to allow each council member to participate as fully as he or she may be able to. Once again, these situations are rare, and please seek the advice of myself and or the FPPC. So the procedures when well, before we move on to that, does anybody have any questions regarding how we go through this 4-part test? We've already covered a lot of information here. Hearing nothing, I guess we'll move on. So the procedures when a conflict of interest are present. The official must refrain from the following. It's not just making government decisions and whatnot and voting. Must refrain from participating in the government decision. Must refrain from discussing it publicly, and must refrain from using an official position to attempt to influence it. During an agenda item, typically the way that this happens, and you can see some of this bolded, is a public official is required under the Political Reform Act and FPPC regulations to disclose and describe in detail the financial interest. So it's insufficient to say that I'm recusing myself because of a financial conflict. You have to identify it and state why. So you have to say, I am recusing myself because I own a home within 500 feet of that location, and there would be a reasonably foreseeable material financial conflict of interest. And that's what the FPPC requires. When meetings started being held in Zoom and everybody was kind of working from home at the beginning of this pandemic, the FPPC sent out an advice letter highlighting this provision specifically, stating that people were not adequately identifying conflicts. This circulated to all the local agencies in California and prompting many city attorneys to write advice letters about how we need to be adequately identifying conflicts of interest under the FPPC regs. In addition, the official is required to leave the room until discussion and voting on the item is completed. In Zoom meetings, we have adjusted that to remove the public official to the waiting room. This is consistent with the advice given by FPPC and basically given by other city attorneys on listservs. This has seen as best practices since everything went remote. There is an exception to the leave the room requirement, which we will get to a little bit later. So open session items after the agenda item announcement, but prior to any discussion or vote, the official must publicly identify and detail the interest that creates the conflict and step down from the dais and leave the room or go to the waiting room of the Zoom platform. And this is very important. It must be before any discussion. The public official may not participate. During consent calendar items, however, the public official has to identify and disclose and not participate, but they may remain on the dais and they may remain in the Zoom platform. This is because typically on consent calendar items, unless they're pulled for discussion, there is no discussion on the item or attempt to influence the decision of others. The official simply just abstains. During closed session items, prior to the start of closed session, the official must publicly declare the need to disqualify him or herself under the same criteria, and then cannot be present during consideration of the item and may not obtain or review any non-public information regarding the decision. So the public official in this instance has to be kept in the dark, as does the rest of the public with respect to closed session privileges. So these procedures continued. There are limited exceptions, and that's when participating as a member of the general public. It's important to note that public officials do not lose their First Amendment rights just simply by virtue of being selected for public office, whether through appointment or election. Elected officials as well as appointed officials retain their First Amendment rights. They retain their ability to speak as individuals. The problem really arises when it's unclear to the public or the city which hat the elected official or appointed official is wearing. So as you'll see later in our presentation, and I believe in agenda item 2, there are lots of rules that this city has instituted as well as other cities that require an official when they are speaking as a private citizen to make it very clear that there are no titles. This is a personal opinion. They are not speaking on behalf of the city. They are not speaking in their capacity as official. And this is simply a First Amendment thing. Typically, when this happens in other jurisdictions, and what I have done in the past, is the decision must make, or the official must make an election. You have to choose to be a private citizen, or you have to choose to be a representative. You can't have it both ways. So if you wish to speak on an agenda item, you should remain off the dais for the rest of that agenda item. Other jurisdictions are more strict. They will require you to remain a private citizen for the rest of the meeting. And so it's very important that the public is made aware that this is done based on First Amendment rights as an individual, not as an elected official or as somebody with the authority of the city behind them. Once again, advice from myself or the FPPC may be required to navigate some of these pitfalls. So the keys to complying with these financial conflict of interest laws are really, it's the keys to compliance with any law. You have to know why the laws exist, what the evil they're trying to prevent is. And so if you know why the law exists, in this case, it's to prevent an official from relying on exclusively personal interests and violating the public trust by acting in a self-interested way. What we're really looking at here is breach of fiduciary responsibilities. And so when acting on the public's interest, the public official has to act in a self-disinterested way. And so if we know that, and we know that we might benefit or lose something from the decision, and that would influence our ability to make a well-informed or decision in a selfless way, then we know that, hey, something's triggered me here and I should really investigate this a little bit more. And so the other reason is that we learn how to identify these financial interests early, so we don't find ourselves down the road a little bit having made a number of decisions and then wondering whether or not we're safe. And then, as I said earlier, when in doubt, sit it out. it's a very rare occurrence when we have 3 or 4 city council members that have to abstain. The city business will go on, even if one of you does not participate or 2 of you don't participate. It's key to understand the big picture. Most of our decisions are very small, at any given time, and there are bigger, larger objectives that the city is pursuing. And it's unlikely that one council member will be prohibited from voting on big picture items. And so once again, don't try to memorize all of these rules. They are constantly changing. There are a ton of them, and it requires a lot of research and factual analysis. So ask for advice if you are ever concerned. So with that, we can go into penalties for violation. Excuse me 1 second. So violations of any of these conflict of interest laws or financial disclosure laws, mass mailing, campaign contribution, gift honorary loan, there's a whole host of laws relating to elected officials and appointed officials are punishable by various civil, criminal, and administrative penalties. And they all depend on the severity of the violation and degree of the intent. So some of these penalties include immediate loss of office. The FPPC can remove you from office. They can institute a lifetime bar of you ever holding office again. They can impose a bar of forbidding anyone holding any form of office that allows them access to public treasury funds. They can fine $10,000 or more. Usually with the FPPC, $10,000 is their start off point. So it's important to note that these are personal fines. The city will not indemnify you and will not pick them up. They come out of your personal pocketbook. And so that's another thing that most council members are not used to hearing. There can be jail time of up to 6 months. Courts may set aside decisions if the official fails to disqualify. This one's rare because there's a public policy in favor of final government decision. But if a public official has engaged in a series of illegal decisions, let's say with respect to a general plan or a housing element or something like that, the courts can set aside that whole thing and set the public agency back several months and potentially hundreds of thousands of dollars. And then, of course, we get into untimely filing of Form 700s, which end up with late fees of $10 per day per infraction and up to $100 max penalty. So campaign contributions. Before we jump into contributions and gifts and honoraria, does anybody have anything? Any questions, anything they want to drill down on?
No questions. Thank you, Kevin.
All right. Awesome, you're welcome. So generally appointed officials, and when we get into campaign contributions and we get into behested payments, there's going to be some distinctions that are drawn here. We're going to talk about elected officials versus appointed officials, and sometimes these can be a little bit awkward in the way that they operate, because in our city, at least, city council members wear both hats. So, for example, if you find yourself on Port Hueneme Water Agency, you are an appointed official for purposes of these rules. You are not elected to that agency. And so it's important to recognize which hat you're actually wearing, because you can be subject to different rules at different times. And what might be completely legal for a council member is not legal for a PHWA board member under the same circumstances. So basically, appointed city officers may not solicit, direct, or accept campaign contributions of more than $250 from any party or participant or their agents while a proceeding is pending before the officer's agency and for 3 months following the date of this decision. To think about this one is think about sitting as a planning commissioner. You're appointed to a planning commission and you've solicited $250 from the Building Industry Association, let's say. That's typically how a planning commissioner or a city council member sitting as a planning commissioner can find themselves in trouble under this. So this prohibition applies even if contribution is directed to another candidate. So if you're a sitting, I believe this comes up because I'm always surprised to see this example on the next slide, but if you're a sitting planning commissioner member and say, I'm going to vote to approve your conditional use permit as long as you make a $500 contribution to the mayor's next campaign. That is illegal under the Political Reform Act. It starts to look also like quid pro quo arrangements and things of that nature, and it should be fairly obvious that there's, even if you can't identify specifically what's wrong with it, something about it is just wrong. So Parties, participants, or their agents may not make contributions of more than $250 to an officer during the course of the proceedings and for 3 months following the decision. And this gets back to this. Elected officials, to my caveat earlier, elected officials are subject to contribution restrictions when sitting as members of other boards or bodies to which they were not elected. For example, joint powers agencies, regional governmental entities, or local agency formation commissions. So I would think the City and Port Joint Standing Committee, the PHWA, a number of the regional transit authority boards and whatnot that each of the council members sit on, that these are all appointed positions. And so they can subject you to different rules. So once again, my example that I'm always surprised to see, planning commissioner asks the developer to make a campaign contribution to the mayor when the developer has a pending subdivision map scheduled for a public hearing with the planning commission within the next 2 weeks. This would be a crime under the Political Reform Act. So with respect to campaign contributions, sometimes they can result in disqualification. And typically an officer is disqualified from participating in a decision when the officer learns that the party who is directly affected by the decision has contributed either directly or through an agent more than $250 to the officer within the preceding 12 months. So our example here is like an architectural review board member is running for city council and discovers that the applicant seeking the board's approval tonight gave her a $500 campaign contribution last month. This would require public disclosure of receipt of the contribution and recuse yourself from participating in that decision until the applicant's project. Regarding the applicant's project, it would also prohibit you from receiving future contributions for a period of 3 months. Now, a covered officer who receives a campaign contribution of more than $250 within the preceding 12 months must disclose that fact in the record of the proceeding. And so if there is a public hearing, the officer should make the disclosure on the public record at the beginning of the hearing. If no public hearing is held, the disclosure should be included in the written record of the proceeding. Campaign contributions are kind of one form of quid pro quo illegal agreement that we tend to see. Another one is what we call illegal contracts. These are found in section 1090. Any of you who are familiar with our professional services agreements or the city's kind of boilerplate agreements that we use, there's usually a government code section 1090 section that asks the people to verify that there are no interests that would violate 1090. And so public officials are prohibited from having a financial interest in any contract made by the board or the body of which the official is a member. So a school district board member votes to approve school district payments to her own travel company. The city manager writes his own loan documents and lends himself $80,000 of taxpayer dollars. These are direct financial interests, and these prohibitions apply to elected and appointed officials as well as public agency employees. The key things with respect to 1090 contracts is that it applies to preliminary discussions, negotiations, planning, solicitations of bids, as well as entering into the contract or voting on it in itself. So once again, we're seeing no influence, no participation. Disqualification with respect to a prohibited contract is not a cure. With a limited exception, employees who do not participate in making a contract, when the prohibition applies, and as you can see, this is bold, it is unlawful for the agency to enter into the contract at all. The contract is void on its face and can be avoided as if it never happened. So the contract would end up being completely unenforceable if there is a section 1090 prohibition. So once again, there are exceptions, as there are with every single thing in the Political Reform Act, and they are very fact specific. And so what we have to look at is we have to look at whether or not these interests are too remote. And so with respect to Government Code Section 1090, there are statutory remote interests. The official must publicly disclose the source of the conflict and disqualify him or herself. These remote interests include that of a parent in the earnings of his or her minor child for personal services, that of a landlord or tenant of the contracting party, and that of a supplier of goods and services to a party contracting with the official's agency when those goods or services have been supplied by the contracting party by the officer for at least 5 years prior to his or her election or appointment of office. So, like I said, very factually specific. They don't come up very frequently, but typically where we see Government Code Section 1090 in any of the news or the literature, is when a elected official has a side business and they try to get their side business a government contract. And that's typically a 1090 violation. And that's usually when we hear it. They're pretty easy to spot and they should be pretty easy to be aware of. There are also exceptions for non-interest, and these are certain types of interests that are so minor that the state considers them just a non-interest, and that's when an official receives public services provided by his or her agency on the same terms as services provided to the general public. So, for example, a sewer or a solid waste services agreement between any of the city council members residing inside the city is offered on the same terms as everybody else. There is no special arrangement. And so that contract by itself is not sufficient to trigger a 1090 violation. Also, reimbursement policies under the city, reimbursement for travel and other things for official duties and in the performance of those duties, as well as subject to a written policy, are not 1090 violations, as well as are unsalaried members of nonprofit corporations, if the official is one of those. Unlike remote interests, non-interests do not require abstention or except in limited circumstances disclosure. So a non-interest simply is just something we don't consider to be an interest at all. Once again, fact specific and would require quite a bit of an analysis to figure out, in which case you would also still want to get an FPPC determination letter because they're the only ones that can immunize you. So penalties for violation of Section 1090 is all of the parties are deprived of the benefits of the contract. The contract is void and cannot be enforced. There can be fines of up to $1,000. And the official who engaged in it can be forever barred from holding office in California. And depending on the severity of the violation, it can result in prison. Leaving public office or employment. This is the revolving door restriction that we talked about a little bit earlier, or I touched upon. State law prohibits officials from trading on their relationships developed in public service for their own benefit. So an elected city official, city manager, and certain district officials are prohibited from representing persons for pay before their former agencies for 1 year after leaving office or employment. There are exceptions, and that is when the official is representing his or her personal interests, or when representing another public agency that has a matter before the former public agency. So the real trick here is basically trading on relationships you've made with the city in order to better your own financial position through business. Typically, we view this as kind of like a non-compete, and you have to simply wait a year before you can go practice in front of your former agency. For pay, that is. There is also the prospective employer restriction, and this bars city officials and employees from participating in making, or using their official positions to influence governmental decisions directly relating to any person with whom such officials and employees are negotiating or have any arrangement concerning prospective employment, or whether or not they've accepted offers of employment and whatnot. This is kind of setting yourself up for your next job kind of prohibition and whatnot. And so the theory here, if we're talking about the why of this, is this looks like something that would be hard not to resist. Hey, if I do this, maybe this will better my positions with my future employer. Obviously, we can see in there that there would be some motivation, or there could be some motivation for the official to act in a self-interested way, and that's usually what triggers all of these analysis as well as these conflicts. There are exceptions to this. Once again, we're looking at the public generally exception and the significant segment of the public test that we looked at when we were looking at materiality, or not materiality, step 3 of the 4-part test for identifying financial conflicts of interest. Another one is the legally required participation exception, which I've already said is incredibly rare, or when the prospective employer is a state, local, or federal governmental agency. So leaving public office or employment when an employee is elected to a legislative body of the employing agency. In essence, a person who works for a city and then is elected to the city council of that city cannot serve as both master and servant. So an employee of a local agency cannot be sworn into office as an elected or appointed member of the legislative body unless he or she resigns. Should the employee refuse to resign, the position terminates automatically. So once that person is sworn into office, their former position terminates and the new position is assumed. Interestingly enough, the employee does not get a choice in the matter. It's either you resign your former position or you don't get sworn into office. If you do get sworn into office, whichever the later position to be held is the one that wins out. So that's something that sometimes surprises most people when I've seen it at other agencies where somebody was sworn in and failed to resign their previous position and then were upset about the fact that their position was deemed terminated. Running for office by itself is not prohibited. Really here the cutoff point is being sworn in. No personal advantages or perks. Basically, we shouldn't receive anything for our public service. An individual's status as a public servant and access to public resources should not get special privileges. We have numerous laws regarding personal advantages, gifts, and perks. This is where we get into some of our gift reporting, gift exceptions, gifts of travel, loans to public officials and loans to city employees, gratuities and rewards, bans on honoraria, restrictions on the use of public resources, misappropriation of public funds, expense reimbursement, compensation, mass mailing restrictions, prohibition on gifts about public funds. We're going to try and get through these pretty quickly. Many of these are things that I believe each member of this council are familiar with. We've discussed them periodically as time goes on, and they arise from time to time. So the gift limit rule. This limit usually changes about every year. Currently, I believe it's $520 annually. And so a city official may not receive a gift or gifts from a single source in the aggregate of $520 or more during a calendar year. The definition of a gift is any payment or other benefit provided to a public official that confers a personal benefit for which the official does not provide goods or services of equal or greater value. Discounts and rebates not provided to the general public constitute gifts, as do forgiveness of loans that are not made on equally favorable terms. There are many, many, many exceptions to the gift definition, as well as the reportability rules, as well as the recusal rules. So unless an exception applies, public officials must report all gifts valued at $50 or more received from a single source per calendar year on their Statement of Economic Interest Form 700. Public officials also should either not receive or return gifts exceeding $520 in the aggregate from a single source in a calendar year. Avoid accepting a single large gift or series of gifts during a calendar year from the same gift giver totaling more than $520. In the event an elected official finds that he or she has accepted gifts in excess of $520 in the calendar year, they have to disqualify themselves from any decisions involving the gift giver or the single source. Evaluation of gifts typically is done by fair market value. So as of the date received, there are some interesting things that happen with fair market value. A lot of this has to do with like printed face value on tickets and things of that nature. There are different, the FEPC actually went in depth on this, and there are different regulations applying to each one. So also like foreign admission, ticketed and invitation only events, those are exceptions to the fair market value rule. Attendance at nonprofit, political fundraisers, air travel, things of that nature. There's a whole bunch of weird stuff in there. In the event you find yourself concerned about this, please reach out to me or contact the FPPC. The exceptions to the gifts. Some items may not be considered gifts dependent on associated facts, and therefore it's not subject to gift disclosure. There are other restrictions that usually apply to these. So things such as informational materials, gifts returned unused to the donor within 30 days, gifts donated unused to a nonprofit within 30 days can save you, gifts from specified extended family members, campaign contributions, personalized plaques and trophies with an individual value of less than $250. So prizes or rewards received in bona fide competitions. If you bowl in a bowling league and you win, you can accept a trophy. It's fine as long as the competition itself is a bona fide competition and isn't given based on your status as a public official. Devises or inheritance. Devises are gifts made by will. Inheritance are gifts outside of the will process. So any gift given in contemplation of death and whatnot is outside of this. Benefits received as a guest attending a wedding or a civil union if the benefits are substantially the same as received as other guests. If the gift received for attending one of these things is significantly more expensive than any other guest received, odds are it's a prohibitive gift. Bereavement offerings, reciprocal exchanges. So when we're giving gifts to family members or exchanging gifts at social events, the key here really is exchanged, not so much, if you remember the definition of a gift basically said, without some other good or service being offered in exchange. So it's really not applicable when we have reciprocal exchanges, particularly among family members. So long as these exchanges are not disproportionate in value, we should be fine. So further exceptions, there are special reporting rules. Payments to a city or agency are considered a non-gift to the official if certain requirements are met. We see this periodically, and there are other rules that the agency has to file. Typically, there's a form that has to be sent to the FPPC, as well as a posting to the agency's website, and usually there has to be a written policy as to how these gifts are doled out. So these gifts tend to be donated to the city. They're not designated for any specific individual. They're used for official city business. The agency head selects the recipient of the gift, and the city reports payment within 30 days to on the Form 801. And then we post the Form 801 on the city and FPPC website. Typically, I believe you also have to have a written policy as to how these gifts are given out so that it's not, you avoid the appearance of favoritism as well. Tickets or passes distributed to a city or agency to an official is considered a non-gift when it's reported by the official as taxable income. The city complies with Form 802 and 801. And the ticket or pass is the same as all other tickets or passes, does not include food or beverage. So as long as it's a general admission pass, we're good. If it's admission to the Laker Club, maybe there's going to be some problems with that. In addition, a ticket or pass given directly to an official is considered a non-gift when the ticket is provided to perform a ceremonial role or function. Throwing out the first pitch at a Major League Baseball game is certainly one of those. Anything where the official is there on the city's behalf. Participation must be requested as part of the event. It has to still be reported as taxable income, and we still have to comply with the Form 802 requirements, which is posting on the FPPC website and identification to the FPPC. So typically these things require disclosure, and you've seen this a number of times come up on Form 802 and 801. The name of the person receiving a ticket or pass, the description of the event, the date of the event, the face value of the ticket and or pass, and the number of tickets or passes provided. If the ticket or pass is behested, the name of the official who behested the payment. And like I said, that rule just changed. I think they want a lot more information now. And there's a description of public purposes for distribution of the ticket or pass. Form 802 is maintained by the city as a public record and is posted on the city's website within 30 days of distribution and linked from the city's website posting to the FPPC. So there's a lot of stuff that goes on with respect to receipt of class gifts, so to speak, or gifts to elected officials through the city. There are exceptions, special reporting rules for fundraisers and things like that. There are other rules that apply to nonprofit fundraisers, 501c3 organizations, and political fundraisers. There's a link here to an ethics training guide and certain other fact sheets that the FPPC puts out through their website. There's a whole host of things. If you're interested in reviewing any of this further, you're certainly free to reach out to me, and I can I can give you some interesting materials. Gifts of travel. Travel's an interesting one. It has a number of old prohibitions that date back to the Union Pacific Railroad and whatnot that are present in our Constitution. But for the most part, payments, advances, or reimbursements made to public officials for travel expenses include transportation, parking, lodging, and meals are reportable gifts to the official, subject to the $520 gift limit. Now, despite the general rule, the FPPC regulations and the Political Reform Act describe many circumstances and situations when travel payments will not be gifts. One of these examples is when the payment is for travel and related per diem expenses received from an official from a local, state, or federal governmental agency other than his or her own, when the travel is for education, training, or other interagency programs for purposes is not subject to the gift limit for reporting requirements. So for example, if Ventura County wanted to send a couple of our city council members to a training on council commissioner relations or something like that, and they were willing to pay for it, that likely would not constitute a gift under the FPPC regulations. There is a caveat, however, and that is that regulations relating to gifts and other payments for travel are highly detailed and various reporting rules and exemptions apply. I feel like the common theme here every time I do this is highly detailed, incredibly fact specific. You're probably going to get very tired of hearing me say that throughout all of these rules, but that is the nature of the Political Reform Act. Now, the California Constitution prohibits all public officers, elected and appointed, from accepting passes or discounts from transportation companies. This prohibition does not apply when free or discounted travel is available to the public generally and is given for reasons unrelated to the person's status as a public official, such as when there's an upgrade from first class or upgrade given to a honeymooner or free airline travel because the spouse is a flight attendant and whatnot. Interesting thing that this appears in our Constitution. I believe it really starts with the railroad and use of free railroad travel as a means to bribe Washington as well as California state politicians back in the gold rush days. And so it's got a long and storied history with it, but it was deemed important enough to be a constitutional amendment at some point. Loans, in my opinion, personal loans made by a government are not a good idea. The city doesn't do them, period. We avoid a lot of this, but I don't know why a city would engage in giving personal loans to its own officers and elected officials, but it does happen. So there are limits and restrictions on loans. Public officials and staff that manage public investments may not accept loans exceeding $250 from any employee or consultant. Public officials and staff that manage public investments may not accept loans exceeding $250 from any individual or entity that has a contract with the city. Elected city officials may not receive a personal loan of $500 or more unless the loan is made in writing and all terms are included in the loan document. Typically where we see this is, as it's going to talk about right here, financial institution loans on terms available to the general public. These things tend to be okay. So if we're talking about credit cards or other financial institutions providing the loan, and these things are offered on terms that are the same as the general public's terms, and there's no quid pro quo or special requirements or something like that, these loans tend to be all right. Obviously, we don't see anything here that entices the elected official to act in a particular way. There's no quid pro quo, so we're not as worried about these things when the public generally applies. However, as I stated a little bit earlier before, when not repaid or payments do not meet certain thresholds, personal loans can become gifts subject to gift limits when they're forgiven and there's no penalties or things of that nature. So if a public official receives a loan forgiveness with no penalty as a result of their position as an elected official, that becomes a gift. In addition, loans that are made without any real intent of paying them back, which has happened frequently in the past with various other cities, those are deemed gifts as well. They are not loans. So gratuities or rewards. It is a crime for a public official to ask for, receive, or agree to receive any kind of gratuity or reward in exchange for performing official duties. The penalties can include 6 months imprisonment in the county jail and or a fine of up to $1,000. Honoraria ban. Public officials may not receive honoraria, payment for giving a speech, writing an article, or attending a public or private conference convention. This includes gift cards or any gift more than nominal value or benefit provided in connection with the above activities. Now, pens, pencils, notepads, or similar items are not considered honorarium. Typically, these are given to everybody in attendance. So we have the public generally thing going on there as well. And they're of such nominal value that we don't anticipate that, somebody's going to travel the speech circuit collecting pens. So there's really no issue with some of those things, but any payment for a speech, like we look at former presidents making $100,000 per hour for a speech, that would be illegal under California law while that person is in office. As with gifts, there are also several exceptions, including payment returned unused to the donor within 30 days, payment deposited to an agency's general fund within 30 days, and payment donated to a tax-exempt nonprofit organization. There are additional exceptions and special rules that apply to reporting and receiving honoraria. It's complicated. The general rule is probably don't. It's not worth it. Restrictions on the use of public resources. State law prohibits public officials from using public resources for personal or political purposes. This includes staff time, office equipment, office supplies, public agency vehicles for personal errands, etc. You see this arise from time to time. I think there was a mayor in another city who also had a private law practice, and he used the city clerk as his legal receptionist. And that was deemed to be use of staff time and basically a gift of public resources as well, since he wasn't paying fair market value for it. So we also got some other interesting things that come up with ballot measures. Local agencies are prohibited from taking, they may take positions on ballot measures, but they're prohibited from engaging in advocacy. So a position may be taken in an open meeting where all points of view can be heard. They can also provide, public agencies can provide informational materials to ballot measures. However, they cannot use public resources to engage in a campaign or engage in any advocacy whatsoever with respect to the agency's position. That includes creating or disseminating materials urging voters to vote yes or no on measures, or materials whose style, tone, and timing indicate the purpose is advocacy and not fairly presented facts provided for informational purposes. That is one that gets challenged frequently. It's very that style, tone, and tenor and timing is a really difficult one. Even when we did Measure U, there were people who claimed that we crossed the line into advocacy by talking about what we anticipated the revenue generation to be on it, even though it was based in factual scenarios. It's really difficult that if anybody doesn't like what you're saying, they'll say that you're not providing information, you're engaging in advocacy. And so when we have ballot measures out there, and we're probably going to have one this year, it's important to remember that it's informational only. It has to be neutral. It has to be objective. It cannot be advocacy. In addition, there are mass mailing restrictions, which we're not allowed to send more than, I think it's 250 in a month of similar articles. So think of like campaign materials and things of that. That is illegal under the act as well. Misappropriation of public funds. So misappropriation, what we also know this as is embezzlement, so to speak. So public officials charged with the receipt, safekeeping, transfer, or disbursement of public monies are prohibited from the law from appropriating such funds to their own use or for the use of others. It is also a crime to falsify or fraudulently alter or conceal any public account or record, or for a public official to willfully fail to pay over to an authorized official any money received by him or her under any duty imposed by law. Typically, we won't see this with a council member. There's not much finances running through the city council. It's usually, we see this when we have an elected or an appointed treasurer, and certain bigger cities where the treasurer is elected, we see some of these violations occur. So our example is a city council member funnels money from the city's general fund and uses it to pay gambling debts. The city's treasurer destroys the financial reports that would prove this happened. Both have committed a crime, misappropriating public funds, and would likely go to prison. Excuse me?
Has that actually ever happened? Somebody doing that? That's just craziness to me.
You would be surprised if I come across any. Like recently, it's kind of amazing how many things people try. But every now and then you'll see it on Western City or on some of the listservs. If I come across something like this, I'll forward it to each of you if you're at all interested.
Yeah,
but
that's just comical.
It sounds like City of Bell. City of Bell did a lot of stuff like this until the FBI got involved. You also might want to look at Hesperia. Hesperia and Adelanto have had a lot of trouble lately. So like I said, criminal penalties will get you 2 to 4 years in state prison, permanent disqualification from public office. Civil penalties can include $1,000 per day of violation, 3 times the value of the resource used. That's treble damages, which are usually available in fraud cases. and possible reimbursement for the cost of any litigation initiated by private individuals, including reasonable attorney's fees. And here we start getting into some PAGA claims, Private Attorney General Act. And anybody familiar with litigation knows that that can get very expensive very quickly. So expense reimbursement. Typically when the city has an expense reimbursement policy, I'm thinking of like per diems and things like that. Those expenses and reimbursements must be actual and necessary to the official's performance of official duties. Cities must adopt expense reimbursement policies that specify the kinds of activities that will be reimbursable. They must also use expense report forms as well as documenting expenses with receipts. These documents are public records and they are subject to disclosure. Penalties for violations of expense reimbursement laws. California law penalties are loss of reimbursement privileges, restitution to the local agency, civil penalties of up to $1,000 per day and 3 times the value, and criminal prosecution and a lifetime bar from public office. The feds are a little bit harsher. They consider this tax evasion and the fines can be up to $100,000. They can put you in federal prison for 5 years. They can charge you with the costs of prosecution. If the Postal Service is used, they can charge you with mail and wire fraud. Anybody who's been following what's been going on with that. With respect to computer hacking, those people are being hit with 185-year sentences. The sentences are fairly draconian, best to avoid it. If federal funding is involved, corruption and embezzlement apply. And like I said, if the feds start looking into somebody for some of these things and they've engaged in wire or computer fraud, which basically means they've sent an email or used a cell phone, they're looking at imprisonment for the rest of their natural lives. It is quite draconian. Compensation limits. So this is something that comes up from time to time, and we're a charter city, so we have a little bit of a different rule here, but government code sets the maximum amount of stipend that a city council member may receive. So in a general law city, they may not enact an ordinance providing for compensation to elected officials in excess of the schedules authorized under the government code. These schedules go by population size of the city and they set out the actual stipend number. Because council member compensation is a purely municipal affair under the city's charter and home rule doctrine, we are allowed to violate the state's general laws. And I believe we're about double what the general code says that we're allowed to do. The other thing that can happen is you can put the matter to the voters on a ballot measure and the voters can approve it. And that will kind of save a city from doing so, or from finding themselves in violation of the state's general laws. Now, this is the mass mailing restriction. Any mass mailing sent at public expense are subject to strict regulation under the Act. So anything that is over 200 substantially similar pieces of mail, not including form letters or things like the mailers that we put inside of utility service mailers, those are not counted for purposes of this. This applies, you see this a lot. This applies, so like, we'll look at this, is prohibited if it meets all of the following criteria. It's a tangible item, so a document, a record, a button. It's mailed or delivered to a specific address. It features an elected officer of the agency sending mailing. Or includes the name, photograph, title, office, or other reference to an elected official, and is prepared or sent in cooperation, consultation, coordination, or concert with the elected official. Distribution cost paid with public funds for productions costs exceed $50, and there are more than 200 substantially similar items sent in a single calendar month. So this really looks like campaigning and whatnot. Like I said, there are a host of exemptions for this. The agendas and meeting minutes, requested, solicited, or subscription items. So when we see somebody who, let's say we were going through the CEQA process and somebody requested notice of all CEQA proceedings, that would be legal. Press releases, legal notices, things that people request on their own. There is also a new or relatively new pre-election temporal prohibition. And so usually letterhead, roster listings, meeting event announcements, and business cards are exempt from the mass mailing prohibition, but now they cannot be sent by or behalf of a candidate appearing on the ballot 60 days before an election. So for 2 months prior to the election, these cannot go out.
That's new.
Which is relatively new. I believe that came about probably about 12, 14 months ago.
Business
There's
card.
been a
So that
lot.
means That means no earlier than 60 days, you can't hand out like business cards you make on behalf of your election campaign.
You can. It's important to remember that this really applies to mass mailings using $50 in public funds. So by
Oh, okay.
yourself, you can engage in this sort of behavior because on your own time with your own money, there's no problem with it. That being said, there may very well be other restrictions. I know that there have been issues in the past and lots of new regulation on campaign signs and temporal restrictions, because if you're familiar with First Amendment regulations, we can governments can regulate time, place, and manner restrictions so long as they're reasonable. And so there have been advancing laws and whatnot on what is a time limitation that's reasonable for campaign signs and for campaign related activities that doesn't infringe on First Amendment rights. So over the last 3 or 4 years, we've seen more and more regulation into this field, and that area of law is changing as well. If you have any specific questions, by all means, hit me up outside of this and we can delve a little deeper into it. And like I said, this is changing constantly right now. So we can move on to prohibition of gifts of public funds. You'll hear this one frequently when somebody requests the city make a payment to something or something like that. Typically, if they're not on favorable terms or we're not receiving a service for it, it can be seen as a gift of public funds. So the California Constitution generally prohibits giving or lending funds to any person, subject to very certain exceptions. The expenditure must serve a direct and substantial public purpose. There are also exceptions when the city is a charter city. This applies back to the home rule doctrine. It must relate to a municipal affair, something that is not of statewide general concern, and the charter has to authorize it specifically. Outside of a specific charter authorization, which I do not believe ours has, violating California constitutional provisions is dicey, especially given the legal landscape over the last 10 to 15 years. The state of California has really been eroding the home rule doctrine and the authority that charter cities have to violate the state general laws. There's still not very many things that we are allowed to do that violate state general law because everything is now deemed a statewide affair. It is illegal to solicit political support from city employees. Same with campaign funds and things of that nature. So anybody who holds or is seeking city employment to condition city employment decisions on the support of a person's candidacy is illegal. And city officials and employees are prohibited from engaging in political activities while in uniform. That being said, just because you work for a city and because you are elected or appointed by a city, you do not forfeit your First Amendment rights. You just simply reasonable time, place, and manner restrictions. It must be clear that you are on your own time in your own personal and individual capacity before exercising First Amendment rights. So in a city uniform is inappropriate. Wearing city identifiers may or may not be inappropriate depending on your position. And speaking as if you are speaking on behalf of the city will likely be inappropriate unless the city council has authorized such speech. The consequences of this can be up to 1 year in county jail, up to a $5,000 fine, or both. Not to mention the fact that it has a habit of creating a hostile work environment, which tends to get dealt with by DFEH on different ways. Finally, we're into the transparency laws, everybody's favorite subject. We'll start talking about the Brown Act very soon, as well as the Public Records Act. But first, I believe we're going to talk about financial disclosure laws. So this promotes honest and public decision-making. In essence, the public needs to be able to verify financial conflicts. They need to be able to verify basically what we're doing on the public's behalf. And so we're all familiar with the economic interest disclosures, the Form 700s, charitable fundraising disclosures. I believe there have been some changes to California political gift limits, or not gift limits, campaign limits now, based on the fact that the city does not have an ordinance or a charter amendment setting minimum standards. So I believe the new limit is $4,900 annually as far as campaign funding. And I believe any of the PACs organized before a certain date are no longer valid and must re-register. So that is something that happened relatively recently. And those of you seeking to run for re-election probably need to pay attention for that. There's also the Brown Act and the Public Records Act. So economic interest disclosure. The underlying principle of financial disclosures laws is that the public official should not appear to be influenced by the effect of their decisions on their personal finances. And the way that we ensure that is we tell the public what your personal finances are. There are different types of people who are required to file Form 700s. Some of them are statutory filers, such as myself and the city council members. We have to file because the Political Reform Act says so. Other people are what we refer to as code filers, and they have to file because the city's conflict of interest code says so. So certain people are not required under the Political Reform Act, but we subject them to the Political Reform Act anyway, because usually they have some ability to influence city monetary policy. California voters established disclosure requirements for this purpose by approving the Political Reform Act in 1974. And basically, we all have to sacrifice a certain degree of privacy based on the level of public trust we exercise. So public officials and designated employees must disclose financial interests on the Form 700 upon assuming office, and annually thereafter. Your Form 700s are due on April 1st of this year. I believe they can be filed now. Christy should be contacting everybody regarding that. And typically your disclosable interests include sources of income, interests in real property, investments, business positions, and gifts. There are thresholds, exceptions, and reporting requirements that are found on the form itself. I believe there's about 5 to 7 pages of instructions that come along with it. You should all be fairly familiar with it. Behested payments, as I said, this just changed the behested payment requirements. I believe the final rule was approved last week. So there are some distinctions. I haven't updated this yet, as I'm still trying to figure out what the FPPC actually adopted. There's a whole bunch of red line documents that I need to go through and find out what the actual change is. It seems to be that there are more requirements in disclosing the source of the income and how it was used or given. So behested payments are donations made to a government agency or charity at the request of an elected official for a legislative, governmental, or charitable purpose. So behested payments are not considered gifts, but must be disclosed if donations from a single source in a calendar year equal to or exceed $5,000. I believe that $5,000 threshold remains the threshold. So if it's under $5,000 from a single source, there is still no need to report. But anything where an elected official has reached out to somebody and said, hey, will you support this cause of mine? And it's a nonprofit or a governmental cause or something like that. And the gift from a single source exceeds $5,000. There are behested payment reporting requirements that come up with respect to that have to be used in Form 803. And I believe the FPPC just posted the revised Form 803 on Monday. So like I said, this is all brand new. And if you have any interest in this, or you think this might apply to you, please reach out to me and we can start trying to figure out what the FPPC actually did with this. The Brown Act. The Brown Act's always a fun one. Everybody in this room should be very familiar with the Ralph M. Brown Act. I feel like I talk about it pretty frequently, and that it's a very big portion of being a city attorney. This is the California Open Meeting Law, and basically it says a majority of any local legislative body must conduct its business in the context of a noticed public meeting to hear, discuss, or decide any matters within their subject matter jurisdiction. There are exceptions. This is usually when they're at a public conference and they're not, and the legislative body is not discussing city business. They are in an open and publicized meeting held by another organization. So if the city council wanted to attend, let's say the city of Oxnard city council meeting or the Ventura County commissioners meeting or supervisors meeting, then that would be allowable. An open and noticed meeting of a standing committee body or a social or ceremonial event, provided the majority does not discuss public agency business. The Brown Act's posting and agenda requirements. All notices have to be posted 72 hours in advance of a regular meeting and 24 hours in advance of a special meeting. There are some other interesting things that have happened recently. There's a recent case that went out. It's Sierra Watch versus, I believe, El Dorado County. And it had to do with a situation where the city council was provided its agenda on a Thursday for a Monday meeting. And then on Saturday night, there was a revised contract that was emailed to the council by I believe like the community development director or something like that the council acted upon on the Monday meeting. That was deemed to be a Brown Act violation because the public did not get the later revised contract at the same time as the city council. So there's a provision of the Brown Act that requires the city to post it online as well as have it available at a physical location at the city at the same time it is made available for the city council. So what cities have done in opposing this, there's a lot of people who are pushing back on this because essentially a land developer, if they don't want a decision to be made, can continually send out emails to the city council providing them new and updated information, and then we would have to push a council agenda item and delay it or face a Brown Act violation. And so it has some unintended consequences. That decision hasn't been reached, but it's something you should all be made aware of. Once a public record is made available to the city council, it has to be made available to everyone else. It also has to be posted on an agency website if we have one, which we do. Closed session descriptions must be noted in the agenda. There are safe harbors for that, and they follow very specific language in order to take advantage of those safe harbors. There are pre-closed session disclosures. There are post-closed session reporting out announcements that are made periodically whenever a final decision is made. And sometimes there's a production of certain closed session documents, not usually though. Now, closed session restrictions, these are permitted, but only for very narrowly defined purposes. And they include personnel discussions, pending or anticipated litigation, real property negotiation, labor negotiations, liability claims, joint powers agencies, multi-jurisdictional law enforcement. There's a series of them and they are all very, very narrow. The Brown Act, the easiest way to violate the Brown Act is through the serial meeting prohibition. In essence, if two council members talk to each other, send an email to somebody, and a third council member is forwarded to or copied in another communication, you now have a quorum of the council discussing an item of city business within the city's subject matter jurisdiction, and that itself is a Brown Act violation. It is very easy to do. Many of you are also made aware of AB 992 that basically says council members may not interact with each other on social media. Council members may not like each other's posts if they relate to city business or are within the subject matter jurisdiction of the city. They can't like, they can't upvote, they can't retweet, can't winky face. I forget what all the things you can do now on social media are. As you can probably tell, I'm not much for it. But yeah, it's the AB 992 made it really easy. Now it's no longer a quorum. It is if one council member likes another council member's quote on an item of city business, it itself is a violation. It's a misdemeanor. So be mindful of that. That being said, if somebody posts something that's not related to city business, like, you know, they baked a turkey on Thanksgiving or something like that, we can go ahead and like that because that's probably not a violation. The real purpose of the Brown Act is to eliminate backroom dealings and give transparency to government conversations as well as decision making. So the real reason the Brown Act exists is because the public needs to know what we're discussing and they need to be invited to participate. So this requires us to post and follow our agenda. So we have to provide a date and time and meeting location, as well as the items of business we're going to be discussed. When we get off topic and we move into some other area because it's tangentially related, we haven't really told the public what we're going to be talking about. And when we get there, we have to keep in mind, we have to be mindful that we are representing the public. And if the public would have liked to talk about this conversation, or even if they wouldn't, the public has a right to know what we're going to be talking about so that they can make an informed decision as to whether or not they want to appear and be heard. Otherwise, in essence, what we're doing is we're denying them due process of law. Electronic recording. This is an interesting one that comes up periodically, is that any member of the public may record audio or video unless the activity unreasonably obstructs or disrupts the meeting. And what we're talking about unreasonable disruption is that it has to rise to the level that the city's business cannot be carried out. In the event that happens, cities do have authority to remove people from city council meetings. It happens periodically. I've been at meetings where people have been removed, and it really has to rise to the level of the city's actual ability to do business is being impeded. Somebody will not yield. They're throwing things. I think recently somebody lit a fire on the floor in front of the city council members that got them kicked out. There's a bunch of strange things that happen. But in essence, it has to be unreasonable obstruction or interruption. We cannot require the public to sign in. We cannot ask their names. Well, we can ask their names. They're not required to provide it. They are not required to tell us where we live. They are allowed to address the council anonymously. Their residence does not matter. We are free and open, and every single member of the public has a right to talk and address the council. They also have the right to be heard. The agenda must include opportunity for the public to address the governing body on any item of interest. The agency, however, can place reasonable time limits. I believe in our city council policy manual, there's a recommended 3 minutes. It's important to note that this right to be heard, generally in general city council meetings, such as the one we're going to have next Tuesday, the public can talk about anything within the city's subject matter jurisdiction. The only requirement really is that the city has to actually have subject matter jurisdiction over it. So like, for example, a member of the public couldn't come and talk about something the state of New York is doing. We simply don't have any authority over the state of New York, and there's nothing we can do about that. So we could shut down that conversation as not germane to the public. But if it's something the city has the potential to do something about, then we probably have to let it go. There is an exception for special meetings in that public comments can be restricted only to the agenda items. So general comments applicable to citywide city business would be prohibited. And so in a meeting such as the one we find ourselves in tonight with 2 agenda items relating to ethics and council policy and procedures manual and Rosenberg's rules, we could restrict public comments themselves to only those items dealing with efficiency of government and ethical responsibilities. All right. In addition, I want to point out that AB 361, the remote readings bill, had some pretty significant sections on how we guarantee the public's right to reasonable time and the ability to be heard. And so typically when we have something on our agenda that says like public comments 10 minutes, we should leave it open for 10 minutes so that the public can comment. Unless it's clear there are no future public comments, we can move on. And we've been really good about identifying, are there any more public comments? Did we miss anybody? Did somebody show up late who wants to make a comment now? We've been really good about it, and we've been mindful about the public's ability to comment and be heard. And so that's been something that's been of concern throughout the pandemic as we move remotely. And it turns out that public engagement is likely increased as a result of these remote meetings. Penalties for violations of the Brown Act. Typically what we'll see is nullification of the decision. The court will void the decision. There can be criminal sanctions, including 6 months in county jail, as well as a fine of $1,000. There can be other measures. The district attorney can file suits, so can any other interested party. The courts can order mandating of all closed sessions that they'll be electronically recorded so that the court can review them to make sure that we are complying with the Brown Act. Typically, if we lose on a Brown Act challenge, the costs and attorney's fees we can be made to pay them. There can be potential civil rights violations. Most of all, what we tend to see with Brown Act violations is it's just bad press. There's a loss of public confidence in the system. There's a loss of respect in our elected officials, and it's something the news media likes to run rampant with and make an example out of the city. I mean, we still talk about the city of Bell as a result of a lot of its corruption and things of that nature. So Brown Act violations are something we should be mindful of. They're something that we should actively seek to avoid. If the Ventura County Star wanted to ding us on a Brown Act violation, we would all end up with egg on our face and feel pretty foolish. They're likely, I hate to say it, but there typically aren't pretty severe penalties for a Brown Act violation. There can be, but district attorneys have not been pressing them very hard. However, it is only a matter of time till a district attorney feels like making an example out of someone, and then it can be really bad for all involved. There are ways to stave off Brown Act violations. Typically, what we have to do is once we receive a Brown Act letter, we have to go back and rehear the agenda item, issue a mea culpa statement, take full accountability for a violation, say we're sorry, that we promise it'll never happen again, and issue certain other public kind of edicts and actions in order to cure the alleged violation. Once again, it tends to be a very public spectacle. It results in bad publicity and a loss of public confidence. All right, so the Public Records Act. Proposition 59 is a constitutional amendment. Public Records Act is basically says people have the right of access to information concerning the conduct of the people's business, and therefore the meetings of public bodies and the writings of public officials and agencies shall be open to public scrutiny. The Public Records Act is codified in Government Code Section 6250 et sec. A public record includes materials used, prepared by, or retained by the public agency created in the course of conducting the people's business. This includes documents, computer data, emails, including those on an official's personal device. So just because you're not using an official email address or a government issued cell phone, private text messages, private emails, anything that concerns city business is fair game. This is the City of San Jose case that went up to the California Supreme Court, and they determined that city council members' personal emails from personal accounts on their private cell phones needed to be turned over. Exemptions from public disclosure are limited. They are only contained within the Brown Act. Government Code Section 6254K incorporates certain other evidentiary privileges such as attorney-client and work product and official information, and there's a host of other ones, but basically all of the exceptions are narrow. Both the Brown Act and the Public Records Act favor transparency when at all possible. So typically, some of your exemptions are pending litigation. These are documents prepared by the agency in support of ongoing litigation. Drafts, preliminary drafts, notes, or interagency memoranda that are not retained in the agency's ordinary course of business. And usually there's a follow-up requirement with respect to the drafts exception that the public's interest in not disclosing this document must significantly outweigh the public's interest in disclosure of the document. What's important to note is whenever we engage in any of this Public Records Act balancing, we are not concerned with the city's interest at all. It is always that the public has a significant interest in secrecy. So it becomes a different analysis. So everybody can understand why the public official might want secrecy or why the city might want it. The city's interest in these regards is irrelevant. Also, too, the person making the request, the identity of that person and what they'll use it for is irrelevant as well. The only question to be answered is whether or not the record itself is a public record or whether or not there is an exemption that applies removing it from public records disclosure. In addition, public records, once disclosed, are public records forever. You can't claw them back. So requesting records, this is something that also kind of weirds people out when they hear how broad it is. They can be written requests, mailed, emailed, faxed, or personally delivered. They can be oral requests made over the phone. They don't have to take any particular form. The only requirement is they must be specific and clear. If a request is overly broad or unclear, the agency must assist the requester by identifying records, how we keep them, what files they might be under, what types of records we might have, suggest how to overcome any basis for denying access to the records. And even the overbroad, there's a new case that came out, I think about 2 weeks ago on overbroad requests. And they've basically said that overbroad and overly burdensome requests have to be that it's overly broad or burdensome to find a responsive document, not to review a host of potentially responsive documents for privileges. So for example, if somebody said, I want 20,000 documents given to me, and they just identified a broad range of documents, and we go, well, I have to review all those over the next 6 months for privilege, that's not burdensome. What's burdensome is if they want one document that I'd have to search through 40,000 documents to find. It's a bit strange the way the ruling came out, but in essence, in the past, we were able to deny requests that required hundreds of thousands of dollars in man hours to go through. And basically, we did that by stating that the public's interest in non-disclosure and responsible fiscal management significantly outweighed any probative value of the request. We can no longer do that under the Public Records Act. There's also we have 10 calendar days to respond. This initial response, we just basically have to tell people that we either have records or we don't. We don't have to produce them within 10 days. If they are easy to produce, we should produce them in 10 days. We are not allowed to unreasonably withhold records or unreasonably delay their production. There can be a 14-day extension when you have to collect records from remote facilities, or when you have to look through voluminous amount of documents or consult with another agency, or compile electronic information. That 14-day extension only applies when you need to do those things to determine whether or not you have responsive records. If you already know, that 14-day extension goes away and you have to issue your response within 10 days. Options for production of documents is you can either disclose, you can withhold, or you can redact. However, when you do redact, you have to leave intact any segregable information, reasonably segregable information in such a manner as to give as much of the transparency as possible. Requester can inspect the records at an agency's office during regular business hours. They can receive copies of the requested records. We can email them. We can direct them to our website and say, hey, there are records available here. Like, for example, if you wanted to know about cannabis regulations, we have a cannabis page on our website. We could direct them there. Typically, it's easier just to produce the record if we have it available rather than direct them to a website. It tends to look like we're acting in good faith. In addition, we can charge for some of these services so long as the fees coincide with Proposition 26. So for example, if somebody wants to receive the records in hard copies, we do have fee schedules for printing. And I believe we've had a relatively recent fee schedule review and study done to ensure that we are not profiting from this. Anything that if you may remember, Prop 26 makes any charge for services, if it's more than the reasonable cost of those services, it's a tax and it needs to go to the voters. So that's something that comes up from time to time. Fair process. This is a lot of our due process type stuff. And basically the whole point of fair process is it cultivates trust in the government. All these transparency and due process things. So fair and unbiased decision making, you'll see there 1094.5 Civil Code. That is the statute for administrative mandamus. What we talk about is writ of mandate. That's usually how you challenge government decisions. Campaign contributions and bias. Once again, citing the Political Reform Act. Incompatible offices, Section 1099. We've talked about competitive bidding process for public contracts. Many of you are aware of our RFP process and the city's purchasing policy as to how we go about and actually go out to secure bids and award contracts, sometimes based on lowest responsible bidder, and in the case of professional services, based upon other criteria and decisions affecting family members. So fair and unbiased decision making, when this really comes up is when the council is sitting in a quasi-judicial capacity. This is when we are applying the law or to a series of facts or to an individual. We see this a lot in land use decisions. Anything, conditional use permits, plan development permits, development agreements, things like that. Whenever we're opening up a public hearing for something other than approval of an ordinance or whatnot, we are probably sitting in a quasi-judicial capacity. And what I mean by that is the city council is sitting as a judge would, not as a legislative body is. And so when that comes up, there are a host of other responsibilities that come up. And so as I stated before, conditional use permits, variances, annexation protests, personnel disciplinary actions, application of law to a set of facts or an individual will typically get us to quasi-judicial matters. There can't be impermissible bias with respect to these matters. Basically, we wouldn't want to sit in front of a judge that already demonstrated bias towards us. We would feel like we weren't given fair process. And the same is true here. So if there's a personal interest in the decision's outcome, for example, a court found an elected official was biased and should not participate in a decision on a proposed addition to a home in his neighborhood when the addition would have blocked the official's view of the ocean from his apartment. It's important to know here that we don't know in that fact scenario whether or not the official actually cared. It's the appearance of bias that was problematic. And so when we're sitting in quasi-judicial matters, it's important to be mindful of things you might have said in the past. Anything that's out there in the public record can be used against you later if you've demonstrated bias one way or the other. If we're sitting in a quasi-judicial hearing, somebody could certainly bring it up. And this happens from time to time, especially when there's a request by a land developer or somebody who has a quasi-judicial hearing in front of the council in advance of the hearing might want to have a conversation with individual council members before the hearing. you can see how it would be easy to start trying to allege impermissible bias depending on how the decision goes after the fact. It's probably best to act like a judge and have no ad hoc communication or ex parte communication with people who have business before the city in quasi-judicial matters. Personal bias. This shows up sometimes. So like an example includes strong animosity about a permit applicant based on conduct that occurred outside the hearing, or a strong personal loyalty towards a different party. There can also be impermissible bias based upon ideology and belief. You can see Planned Parenthood cited there, or other political motivations as well. So if somebody is outspoken one way or the other on a particular item, and there's a quasi-judicial matter coming up addressing that item, it is certainly conceivable that an allegation of impermissible bias could be levied against that city council member in that circumstance. So there's also factual bias, which is when information an official might receive outside of a public hearing that causes the official to have a closed mind. This is exactly why we don't favor ex parte communications with judges, and people sitting in a quasi-judicial capacity should not have ex parte communications as well. Dual role influence, and this is when someone plays multiple roles in a decision-making process. So a court concluded that a business owner's fair hearing rights were violated when a public agency attorney made the initial decision to deny the renewal of the business's regulatory permit, and then acted as a legal advisor to a hearing officer reviewing that denial. You will see this happen from time to time with me, especially with land use appeals, and you'll notice that I do not have any hand in the prosecution of the denial. I will not assist the community development director or the prosecuting agency members in doing this, and I do that so that I can advise this council as a neutral. I am not allowed to be a prosecutor and a neutral advisor in the same hearing, and so rather than forfeit my right to advise the council, I rely on our staff to handle the entire prosecution by themselves in order to avoid dual role influence. You can be disqualified when the matter is prejudged. Decision makers are well advised to step aside in participations in quasi-judicial matters when the decision maker has prejudged the matter. When you know, or somebody else might know, that you have a closed mind with respect to that matter, or you have preconceived an unalterable view of the proper outcome without regard for the evidence. The penalties here, typically an administrative decision can be tainted by bias, will be set aside by an agency. We see this with the administrative writ process and whatnot, is when an agency decision is not based upon substantial evidence or otherwise not in accordance with the law, a court reviewing it could set it aside as an arbitrary and capricious decision, are typically the terms that we look at. There can also be due process violations. If this is an individual acting under the color of authority affecting a substantial right, such as a property right, you're looking at United States Code Section 1983 claims, which are deprivations of civil rights under color of law. And that can get us landed in federal court, or more specifically, they would have individual liability that would land the official in federal court. Campaign contributions and bias. Campaign contribution laws generally emphasize disclosure rather than disqualification. Disclosure enables voters to assess the degree an official could be influenced by a campaign contribution. However, in some circumstances, local agency officers must not only disclose contributions, but must disqualify themselves from participating in proceedings regarding licenses, permits, and other entitlements. We saw that with respect to when local elected officials are sitting as members of the planning commission or appointed bodies of the hearing body. Incompatible offices. This happens occasionally. Typically what happens is when offices are incompatible, when either office may audit, overrule, remove members, or dismiss employees of the other office or body, or there's a possibility of a significant clash of duties or loyalties between the offices. If you find yourself appointed to one body while serving on another body, and that body has the ability to enforce any rules against another body, or if your loyalties might ever be divided. What's important to note with incompatible offices is it's not like, is it reasonably foreseeable? If it's at all theoretically possible, the offices are incompatible and you may not hold both of them. So it's an interesting one that comes up. And when somebody is deemed to be holding incompatible offices, we'll get to it in the next slide. When somebody is deemed to be holding incompatible offices, Similar to being sworn in to a public office as a city employee, you are deemed to have vacated the previous or the previous office held as a matter of law. So what is a public office for the purpose of this rule? A public office is a position in government which is created or authorized by the Constitution or some law, the tenure of which is continuing and permanent, not occasional or temporary, in which the incumbent performs a public function for the public benefit and exercises some of the sovereign powers of the state. Why is this important? Because if an official accepts a second office that is incompatible with an office that he or she currently holds, the prior office automatically terminates when the official is sworn into the second office. It would be very unfortunate to find yourself having the position that's terminated being your paying job in favor of an elected position with a stipend. And so that's typically where some of these things have resulted. And it's important to be mindful when we're looking at another public office as to whether or not there is the potential for any overlap or incompatibility of them. Competitive bidding in public contracts. Basically, we want to avoid favoritism. We don't want to steer government work or government contracts to certain individuals or businesses because of political connections, cronyism, favoritism, or other things that we now view as corrupt. This ensures that the public receives the best value for its money by promoting competition among businesses. And in many respects, we go to the lowest responsible public bidder. General law cities must use competitive bidding procedures in the public contract code for projects over $5,000, or adopt the Uniform Public Construction Cost Accounting Act standards, which provide higher dollar amount thresholds. Charter cities, we have a little bit of a different rule. We have to follow public works bidding rules and dollar thresholds set by our codes or charters. Contracts for competitive bid public works projects generally must be awarded to the lowest responsive and responsible bidder. With respect to charter cities, this is getting a little bit more wrinkly lately, especially when we start looking at state prevailing wage laws. When we're using state money, we have to use the state's prevailing wage laws. When we are engaged in a public project, we likely still have to use the state's prevailing wage laws based on the fact that the state can't punish us, but the state has now opined that if you rely on your home rule doctrine to violate the state's general laws with respect to prevailing wage, the state will not give you any other money in the future. And so it's not so much carrot and stick. It's just kind of like, yeah, you're free to do what you want, but that means that we won't give you gifts. And so most cities have opted just to do what the state wants rather than fight for their own home rule doctrine. Other types of contracts apply to public bidding or RFP process under our statutes or not statutes, our ordinances and whatnot. These include, usually they're set off by dollar amounts like above or below $20,000, above or below $5,000 or $10,000, and whether or not they're professional or special services or procurement of supplies, things of that nature. Different types of contracts for services or goods follow different rules, all with the same aim of promoting responsible fiscal policy, transparency to the public at large, fair competition, as well as ensuring that the government is getting the best value for its services. Penalties for violating competitive bidding laws. Agencies improperly awarding a contract to any bidder other than the lowest responsive and responsible bidder may be liable for reimbursing the low bidder's actual cost in submitting the bid. Typically, we will not be responsible for low bidders' lost profits. It's a misdemeanor to split projects for purposes of avoiding competitive bidding requirements. So if the overall project requires competitive bidding, we should go ahead and do competitive bidding. As you can see, yeah.
I know that Councilman Gama has a question. Are we holding it back till the end of the presentation? I think you made a mention to that earlier. Are you addressing questions?
We can do that. I think I've got about 5 more slides left till I'm done with this agenda, or 4 slides left till I'm done with this.
Okay, so we'll just wait. We'll just wait to the end of your 5 slides.
All right. Okay, decisions affecting family members. Typically, when we talk about family members, we're talking about public officials needing to disqualify themselves when it comes down to immediate family. That usually includes one's spouse, domestic partner, or dependent children. Even if the act or a city anti-nepotism policy would not bar somebody from doing something that involves a family member, like let's say it's a more distant relative and whatnot, The best practice might be just to avoid the appearance of bias by voluntarily abstaining from the city. As you saw earlier, when in doubt, sit it out. Sometimes these things, our whole goal here is public trust and confidence. And so even if it's not required, sometimes it might be the best thing to do. Seeking advice, the Fair Political Practices Commission, they put out a host of written materials. You can call them and you can receive formal advice letters. The Attorney General, you can seek an Attorney General opinion on something. That takes a very, 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 very long time. And typically we rely on Attorney General opinions for guidance, but actually getting your own is a very lengthy procedure. And myself, legal memorandums or workshops, I'm happy to help where I can, but I do have to make that caveat that you are not entitled to rely on my advice to avoid application of an FPPC enforcement action. And when to seek advice, when a decision affects your income, real property, personal finances, source of gift, lender, guarantor, business investment, related business entity, campaign contributor, contract, personal interests and biases, business entity owning property, or a business management employment relationship. And today's takeaways: how to spot potential ethical issues, knowing when to seek advice from the FPPC or myself, understanding that ethics laws set the absolute minimum standards of ethical behavior. They are a floor, not a ceiling, and know that ethics is a personal choice, and learn to trust your gut feelings. A lot of these things we know intuitively are right or wrong. So that's the end of that presentation. I will stop sharing and I can field some questions.
Okay, Councilman Gama, you had a raised hand.
Thank you. Kevin, is it true that once you make a comment in social media on city or public business, that is it illegal to then delete it if you, like, let's say I go out and make some kind of statement about whatever, beach parking trees, and then I get some grief and then I delete it. Is that illegal, or is that just unethical?
It might not be either. It all depends on the context. Like I said, these are all very factually specific, and it depends on whether.
Okay, well, let's just make sure that I make a very strong statement about public city business. So there's no factual dispute that I'm making a comment about city business. And then I get some grief and I delete it.
Did the city make the comment? Did they maintain it? Did they create it? Was it done on city resources? Is it on a city website? Is it, if it's personal on a personal website, then that's the Public Records Act. I
thought I heard you say that if we make public comments on city business, it's a part of the record.
Anything relating to city business that you do, creating public records on your cell phone or personal email devices, then yes, that can be subpoenaed as far as a Public Records Act request. However, just because something relates to city business, for example, as I've stated previous times, city council members do not forfeit their individual First Amendment rights, and not everything that a city council member does is a public record for purposes of the Public Records Act. It's sometimes important to not let the overlap of the Brown Act and the Public Records Act get in the way with each other. So if the post to which you are referring meets the definitional criteria of public record, which means that it is created and maintained by the agency in the normal course of business, then yes, it would be a public record and deleting it would be illegal unless it was deleted in conformity with the city's records retention schedule.
Okay, so when it comes to a public hearing, then certainly anything that any of us have said on social media could be, should we, I'm not saying that I have this concern, but I'm just trying to think through it. Like, if you have a concern, particularly in a public hearing, like you said, and you need to disclose it. Like, I made a comment some time ago, or
disclosure in a public hearing. What we're really looking at here, disclosure obligations are triggered when we're talking about a financial conflict of interest. Okay. So normally that's where we're talking about disclosure. Impermissible bias is what I think you're referring to. And that's when, that's usually when a party makes an argument. So like somebody who's in front of the board on a public hearing item, when the board is sitting in a quasi-judicial capacity, makes an argument that certain members are biased against them. If the official knows that they have publicly been biased and has a closed mind, then the official should probably identify that conflict or that bias and refuse to participate. That way they can preserve the impartiality that a quasi-judicial hearing requires. However, it's not something that the law requires if you're biased or you think you might be biased that you're required to disclose. However, if there is a significant public record out there and it would be really easy to prove that a certain council member has a set of feelings on something and is likely unable to be impartial with respect to the facts of that case, then it would be best advised to recuse based on the fact that the odds of the decision being overturned if it's unfavorable in front of the judge might be higher.
Did that answer your question, Councilman Gama? Okay. Councilwoman Hernandez.
Thank you, Mr. Mayor. Oh, thank you, Kevin, for all that detail. That was a lot to put out there. So thank you. I know it's not easy. I had a question about discussion of personnel issues for which we have authority to discuss, provided we're the hiring entity. What's the limitation on discussion during a closed meeting and then going out and interviewing people about the performance of that member of staff, that staff member?
The key here, what I think you're referring to is you're referring to the closed session privilege. Closed session privilege really has to do with information received by the city council or a city council member in closed session that is not disclosed publicly outside of that closed session. The rules as it pertains to information received in closed session is that information may not be disclosed to anyone outside of the closed session privilege without the consent of the entire council. So interviewing somebody outside of closed session who may have been the subject of a closed session discussion is not by itself a violation. It would depend on what that council member said to the individual and whether or not privileged information was in fact divulged.
Okay, thank you.
It appears we have no other questions on your detailed presentation at this point in time. I did have one question. Is there I know I was taking pictures of trying to, all of this detailed information. Do we have a packet that we can just get of this so I don't have to continue to do that?
We do. I was anticipating sending it to you guys this week, but since the FPPC changed their behested payments rule on Monday, I think, and screwed me up, I was going to get it to you perhaps next week. It's a voluminous document that we continually update every time the FPPC changes something. I think it's a good 100 and something pages I'll be sending your way.
That's wonderful. Okay, so barring no questions under part one, we will now move on to, it said roll call vote here. Do we need to have a roll call vote of any of this?
I don't believe you do. It's not even a receive and file. It's just simply a training. So
very good. So now we will move on to
Mayor Rollins, may I ask one little quick question?
Oh, okay. Now I see your raised hand. Yes, Councilman.
I had trouble,
Gama.
but thank you. And this is kind of tongue in cheek, but I'm looking at your sweater right now and it says no new taxes. And I was wondering, could that ever be confused as a public comment or in other words, should we be mindful of where, I mean, it's kind of comical because I love it though, no new taxes, but
no,
anyways.
I got this from the Boston Tea Party, but okay.
It's a fair point. You know, like I said, you don't forfeit your First Amendment rights just by virtue of becoming a council member. And so things like that, like symbolic speech and whatnot, you're allowed to do that. The question really becomes is this the appropriate time, place, and manner for such a thing? Is it, like we could really, and this is kind of highlights the factual specific nature of the argument. Would a reasonable person look at Mayor Rollins' shirt and think that that is the city's official position? Is he speaking as the mayor right now? Has the rest of the council approved that message? And so it does beg a question in that reasonable minds could in fact differ on it. And so if he were to say something like, this is absolutely my personal opinion, does not represent the council's viewpoint, whatnot. And see, but you can see how even tongue in cheek, when we start getting into the gray area and the factual analysis here, you can see how convoluted it becomes. And so that's kind of, I give you the lawyerly answer of it depends.
Well, he took his shirt off, so there you go.
That was just to make me stop talking.
Very good. So barring no other questions on this first works training, we will now move on to the second training, and that is Rosenberg Rules of Order, Council Policy Manual, and the Efficient Meeting Protocol.
This will go much more quickly. I only have 17 slides for this one, and not the 109. I have 17.
Oh, I thought you said 70.
No. After 109, I feel like I need a break. Anyhow, let's get to it. I'm going to share my screen again. All right. Where are we? This is the end of the slideshow. We need to go here. All right, let's play this one. All right, so Rosenberg's Rules and Council Policy Training Manual as they relate to running and conducting efficient meetings. Part of this was over the last year, there's been some concern over following Rosenberg's rules as well as the City Council Policy Manual. And there have been a couple of requests from various council members as to how do we conduct efficient meetings that are on point, that don't go 5 or 6 hours or longer or whatnot. And essentially, what are best practices for handling meetings and agenda items as they come up? And so I've pulled from Rosenberg's rules as well as our own City Council Policy Manual and basically gone through kind of what are the purpose of the rules. The purpose of Rosenberg's rules are to promote efficient and orderly meetings. This requires the rules should establish order. They should actually do what they intend to do. They should be clear so that we understand what exactly it is that we're trying to do here. And you also have to maintain common courtesy and decorum. So not only must we be efficient and must enforce the will of the majority, we also need to protect the minority voters. So we have to maintain courtesy. We have to maintain decorum. We have to be able to, the rules have to be user friendly to this end. And we have to be able to foster healthy conversation, healthy debate and discussion. The rules should enforce the will of the majority while also protecting the rights of the minority to speak their mind and get their viewpoints across. So this gets us into the role of the chair of any parliamentary body or the mayor in our instant case, or the chairman of PHWA or whatnot. And really what the chair's position is to apply the rules of conduct and maintain order. The chair, mayor, really has the power here to conduct how meetings are handled, how long agenda items take, what comments are relevant, what discussion is germane to the conversation. And it's really a balance. There's an art to it. I know we've all seen certain mayors or chairs on TV or something like that who are really short and they rule with an iron fist and nobody gets a word in edgewise. And then we get other people who just let conversation go and go and go and go until we don't even know what we're talking about anymore. And so it's really kind of an art to it as to how do we balance efficiency versus communication and open discussion. And so in order to achieve this, it's very important that the mayor or the chair be well versed in these rules and understand them and how they're intended to operate. And so this is also because usually the mayor or chair's decisions with respect to any of these motions or whatnot are final actions. They can be appealed by the supermajority of the council, but typically it's a final action. And if we don't maintain courtesy and decorum, it can feel very much like certain members in the minority position are shut down from having their say. Another thing that's fascinating about the chair or the mayor is generally participation is limited. It's not because it's required, but it's because the mayor or chair is also the parliamentarian of the meeting and has more of a significant role in the meeting. From a parliamentary procedure, it's usually customary that the mayor or chair plays a less active role as a courtesy to the other members. However, there's no legal restriction stating that the mayor or chair cannot participate as a full member, but where we tend to see a lack or lesser participation is generally it's disfavored that the chair make a motion or second a motion. Usually the chair's job is to be facilitative of motions or suggest them at the time. So with respect to Rosenberg's rules, we'll look at what it takes to establish a quorum. And there's been a couple of times this year where we've really had what I call the present and voting rule. And so we're going to talk about that a few times as to how that operates and what the procedural process is for it. And so generally speaking, and it's the same with our city, is a quorum is one more than half of the members of the body. Basically whatever gets you a majority vote. So in our instances, a quorum for city business is 3 council members. Now, there are special considerations here, and this happens whenever we have the present and voting rule that applies. And it says, so when members are abstaining due to a conflict of interest, the total number present at the meeting are counted for purposes of a quorum. So if we have 5 council members and 3 members are abstaining due to a conflict, we have 5-member quorum. We count all 5 because they are all present. However, when it comes time to a vote, the remaining 2 must achieve a majority vote because we need 51%. So in the event it was 2 that were abstaining, even though we would still have a quorum with the remaining 3 council members, all 5 would be counted for purposes of a quorum. But only 2 of the remaining 3 would need to vote in order to gain majority under the present voting rule. And I know this happens frequently in our small kind of horseshoe-shaped city with respect to where everybody resides and whatnot. But there's really a way to handle it, and the rules really do consider the present voting aspects of things as a way to not paralyze the city from conducting its business. So where I thought was most appropriate with respect to efficiency purposes, and one of the things that gets very kind of bogged down in the rules or is difficult to comprehend, is the procedure for actually handling an agenda item. And this is really where efficiency can come into play, because the parliamentarian here has a lot of discretion in how to do this. By parliamentarian, I'm usually referring to the mayor or the chair of a meeting. For purposes of this meeting, even though I have them hyphenated, I'll just refer to the mayor. So the way that I like to see this done in the recommendation in Rosenberg's rules, as well as our policy and procedures manual, is that the mayor should clearly announce the agenda item that includes the item number, description, as well as the recommendation for the public. This is best just because the members of the public might want to know what's going on, and it also reminds the city council members of like, hey, this is where we are in the agenda, this is the subject of conversation, and this is what the recommended action is. And then what this also does is this is a good time to stop kind of and consider whether or not there are any conflicts of interest that need to be identified. Because if you remember from our previous agenda item, we cannot engage in any public discussion or try to influence the vote of anything that we have a financial conflict of interest in. So at this point is when all financial conflicts should be raised and identified so that we can stop the meeting and remove an individual if necessary. This also might be a very good time to announce that, kind of go over how these rules apply for the public. So the way that this would happen is we announce the agenda item, and then the mayor would say something like, we're going to first hear from staff, then we're going to have public comments, and then we are going to ask clarifying questions of staff, and then we're going to engage in discussion and take a vote. And that way, at least the public, rather than feeling like they haven't been heard, or I know that we see frequently members of the public make a public comment and then expect an answer in return when we can't. It just lets everybody know that, hey, there are a series of rules to apply here, and this is how we go through them. And so once the announcement is made, the mayor or chair should invite the appropriate staff member to make a report. One of the things I say here is that this should be done without any interruptions. There is no reason to interrupt staff members. And so as a result of this, Hold on one second. Echo off. Wow, my computer didn't like me. So when staff is presenting on these matters, it's important to remember that typically the reports are short. Typically they're geared towards a particular outcome. There's usually an opportunity to wait until we can actually ask clarifying or technical questions, which comes next. And so if we allow staff to speak without interruption, we don't end up in side conversations. We don't end up in an area where council members might feel the need to discuss kind of tangential issues as they relate to this matter. And so staff finishes the report, and then following the staff report, the mayor should inquire as to whether any council members have technical or clarifying questions. This is important in that this is still not the time for council member discussion. This is what we're really asking for, is we're asking for council members to ask questions that are necessary for them to formulate a motion. Like if we're unsure as to what this word means, or how would this work with respect to this, just so that we can figure out what is the motion I want to make and what is it I will support. And so once we get there, it's also important to notice that at this point in time, none of the council members have spoken until the mayor has invited questions or comments of a technical nature from staff. Under Rosenberg's rules and under our policy manual, other members of the city council may not speak until recognized by the chair. And so we've been doing a good job with the raised hands features of Zoom. I understand that sometimes that feature is difficult to see, or somebody's sitting there with their hands up and they're passed over numerous times, but we really should try to maintain courtesy and decorum and seek to be recognized by the mayor. Otherwise, what ends up happening is council member can be declared out of order, and they should yield the floor at that time. So continued, after clarifying questions of staff and technical questions are asked, the public should be invited to provide comment. If there are numerous comments, the mayor can limit public comment to reasonable timeframes. Usually this is 3 minutes, or if let's say there are 27 people who all want to speak on the same issue, the mayor is within his rights to have them designate a foreman, so to speak, or a representative to give the gist of the conversation to come here, or with respect to the agenda item. It's important to note that there is sometimes a conflict between the public's right to speak, a council member's right to be heard, as well as the city's requirement to do its business. From staff's perspective, from an attorney's perspective, the purpose of these meetings is because we have business to do. This is not a public spectacle. This is because the council has business before it in order to ensure the proper functioning of the city. We have to also recognize that the public has an interest in these meetings too, and that it's not necessarily efficient government, and that individual council members have an obligation to their public to be informed and to be educated and to speak on their behalf. So sometimes we end up with these almost conflicting interests. And this is, again, where the mayor has to balance what we're trying to do here. And so we're interested in efficiency. We're interested in not interrupting, and we're not interested in having an hour and a half of public comments. Okay. So once we have public comments, we likely can't respond to them unless they're completely germane to the subject matter. The mayor or chair should then invite motions from the city council members. Generally, the chair would invite a motion. Do we have any motions based on what we've heard? They can suggest a motion. I would be willing to entertain a motion based on this. Or if nobody else is willing to, the mayor or chair could make a motion on his or her own. It's important to note here that we still have not gotten to the point of council member discussion. And the reason for that, under Rosenberg's rules, as well as our city council policy manual, is that right now there's nothing really for the council to discuss. There's just a vague agenda item and whatever staff reported on. So when we want the council members to have an active discussion is when we're considering, what are we going to do? What is the recommended action? What is this motion that's on the table? Because when we have that motion on the table and it's achieved a second and we know what the vote is going to be, we have direction. I'm reminded of the Marcus Aurelius quote, what is it, that to a man with no port in mind or something like that, no wind is favorable. And so if you know not to which port you sail, no wind is favorable. The motion provides us our port, so to speak. It provides us it gives us the focus. And the best part about the motion is that we can understand, we can entertain usually up to 3 of them. So we invite seconds, we have the motion, we invite a second for any motions. We can usually entertain 3-seconded motions for discussion at a time. Anything more than that gets kind of unwieldy. It's hard to focus on, it's hard to figure out what we're actually talking about. And so what typically happens is we take the motions most recently made first. So if we have motion 1, motion 2, followed by motion 3, what would typically happen is the mayor would say something like, okay, we're discussing the council member discussion on motion 3 now. So that's typically where if I was the mayor, I would seek the party making the motion for motion 3 to explain why they think it's a good idea. And then we'd have rebuttals, and then we'd have this and that, and any conversations about the motion. At this point, the mayor, if we have 3 motions on the table, the mayor would be within his or her rights to not consider any more motions until the 3 are disposed of. So this is not the time to suggest alternatives. That was what should have been done in the motion making process as well. Once we have motions with seconds, we kind of know where we're going. If none of those are appealing to you, my advice is to vote your conscience. We'll end up back with 0 and the time for making motions starts again. But having general vague discussions about subject matter within the agenda item doesn't really get us anywhere. I'm sure many of you have felt like the dynamic of the conversation keeps changing when there's not a specific motion on the table. And one of the ways that we deal with that is, like I said, we provide guidelines. We provide this kind of port in the storm, like, what is it we actually want to do? And we have these 3 motions. Let's discuss this motion first and only this motion, nothing tangential to it. Then we'll give it a straight up or down vote. If motion 3 doesn't pass, then motion 2, we'll discuss that one, and so on and so forth. If none of them pass, then what'll happen is it's time to make new motions. But now at least we have the focused discussion of the last 3 motions to make a more intelligent motion. And this kind of, I've already covered the next thing, but once the motions are made and seconded, we should have open discussion. Sometimes, typically what I like to do, or what I would like to see, is I would like to see the mayor or the person who made the motion, when we're saying we'll entertain conversation on motion number 3, especially if there are 3 motions, is to restate the motion, repeat it back so that we all know what we're talking about here. Any discussion should be limited to the motion being discussed. And we've talked about why that is. Otherwise, it has the potential to grow, and we find ourselves talking about tangential objects and not about the actual subject matter at hand. The mayor has the ability to enforce this provision by making sure that any discussion or comment is germane and relevant to the motion itself. Anything that is deemed not germane to the motion, it's within the mayor's authority to determine that that council member is out of order and bring that council member back to order. And it's entirely possible to recess, to avoid conversation on that. But there are ways to bring a council member back to order if they insist on taking conversations or making communications that are not germane with the subject matter. As I've said before, courtesy is paramount. It is important that we allow people in a minority position to express their feelings and to argue for their preferred outcome and whatnot. However, they cannot be allowed to hijack the city council meeting and prevent the majority from being able to accomplish the city's job. In the event discussion is brief or limited, that should tell you there's really no reason to have prolonged discussion on an agenda item. It's time to call for a vote and move on. Typically under our policy and procedures manual, I believe that council members are voluntarily asked to stay within 5 minutes for their council comments and any discussions, and they are also required or requested to not speak more than once until at least every other council member has had their turn to speak. So once we've had discussion completed on a motion, mayor should call for a vote. Once a vote is called, discussion is over, and all council members are provided, as all council members have now been provided an opportunity to state their case. So once a vote is called, there is no more discussion. Any discussion is deemed out of order. The only other words that come out that should be stated are yes or no. And if somebody doesn't like the motion that's currently on the table, it's imperative to vote no and try to make a different motion. In essence, if none of the motions on the table are to a certain council member's liking, the council member should have made motions that are to his or her liking. That's just the way it goes. If those motions failed to achieve a second, well, then the majority has spoken. And the only thing left is instead of trying to, I keep using the term hijack the meeting, it's time to recognize that certain council members were given their opportunity to speak. They were allowed to speak their piece, and they're going to find themselves in a minority vote. And that's just how it works. That's how government operates. And sometimes it feels a little bit harsh, but we're all here for a reason. We're all professionals. We've all been selected to do this and maintain decorum and do so in a nice collegial way. Following the final vote, my recommendation is that the mayor should announce the decision and the outcome of the decision, mainly so that the council knows what happens, just in the event that there is a motion to reconsider down the road within the same meeting, but also so that the public can accurately track what happened rather than have 20, 30 minutes of discussion and then a vote and then everybody's yes, 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 yes. And then the public goes, wait, what did everybody vote on? What's the actual outcome? I think it's important for transparency purposes that the public be kind of feel like they've been engaged with during this process, and that way they can feel like their public comments have been heard, their concerns have been addressed, and that they know what action the council took. Do we have any questions as to the procedures for handling an agenda item? I know I kind of rambled on that, but
Then I do.
okay.
For clarity purpose for my notes. So the procedure for agenda items. Somebody requests a motion, for instance, I'd like to make a motion to have ice cream every Friday. The mayor asks for a second.
Mm-hmm.
A second is given. And then what's the discussion part regarding the motion? If we're not discussing the act, we cannot discuss it because it's not on the agenda yet. What are we discussing as it relates to the motion?
Are you talking about when you're making a motion for a future council agenda item, or are you talking about when you're making a motion? Okay, for a future council agenda.
So then this is differentiating between a motion that's happening then versus a motion for a future agenda item.
Right, and in the interest of trying not to commit a Brown Act violation, I was trying to come up with a hypothetical, but I was having difficulty coming out with one that's outlandish enough that it couldn't possibly be considered within the city's subject matter jurisdiction. So, like, for example, like if we're having a discussion about colonizing Mars, for example, and somebody says, I make a motion that we colonize the Western hemisphere of Mars, and that's seconded. And then there's discussion that ensues. The reason why we limit to the actual motion is because we don't want somebody to go, I thought we were talking about Venus. And then we end up in an argument about everything that's not the motion, talking about why Venus is better than Mars when that's not even on the table yet because nobody made a motion and seconded it.
Got it. I missed the part where we were talking about motions during an actual meeting versus motions for agenda items.
Right. So this whole thing was based on how to handle agenda items. And if you look in your packet, if you click the link on agenda item number 2, the Rosenberg's Rules pamphlet, the 2011 revised version, has a I think it's a 9-part analysis as to how to handle an agenda item. And the rules change a little bit when it's a public hearing, but not to such a significant extent that it bears really mentioning.
Councilwoman Hernandez.
Thank you, Mr. Mayor. Mr. Spalding, the Rosenberg Rules of Order, as I read them, does say that there are times when a second isn't necessary, that the parliamentarian, the mayor has the authority to pass the motion or approve the motion even without a second. Can you clarify that?
It's important to remember that Rosenberg's rules are also adopted by non-governmental entities. And so our policy and procedures manual absolutely states a second is required. And it may not be a California state law. I'd hate to say that it is without any real proof of that, but that's certainly best practices in any governmental entity. And it's certainly part of our policies and procedures manual that a second is required.
Okay.
But as you can imagine, private entities could be a lot looser with their rules.
Okay, so we don't have that issue because of our rulings. Okay.
Right.
Thank you.
Councilman Martinez.
Yes, thank you, Mayor. Kevin, I think I'm just a little confused on the steps. I should have asked when you first brought it up, but right now when you said if we have any questions, I'm like, okay, well, I saw this question. So we can make motions and then get a second, and then at the same time, right after that, can someone else make another motion and get another second? And technically
Yes.
there's 2 motions?
Yes, you can do
But
that
you-
with up to 3.
Up to 3. Okay.
And sometimes it's better to handle it that way because you get everything out in front. Everybody knows kind of what they're doing. And so like if I make a motion to approve X, Y, and Z and somebody says, and that gets a second, and then somebody else follows up with, I make a motion to approve X, Y, they make, like, we'll get into this with the motion to amend. I make a motion to approve X, Y, and Z with this caveat. You go, oh, wait, I like that better. I'd like to withdraw my motion.
Okay.
I think by putting all 3 motions or however many motions there are going to be on the table, you get a lot of like, okay, that's a better idea, or I want to support that one. And then it focuses the discussion because we see what our objectives are, not just this broad kind of agenda item. When we craft these agenda items as staff members, we have a little bit of difficulty in that we need to make them specific enough to comply with the Brown Act, but we also need to make them broad enough so as to not stifle council member conversation. And so we don't intend for the council to have very broad conversations, but we have to give you guys some leeway. Otherwise, we find ourselves in violation of the Brown Act. And so it's kind of it's a difficult thing drafting agenda items to give everybody the leeway they need while at the same time focusing everybody and giving the public the specific information they need to know in order to determine whether or not they want to comment.
Okay. I'm also still a little confused on when we can have discussion. Is it
Okay.
Like, let's just say we're voting on something. Is that
Mhm.
when we have discussion and then we all discuss and then we make motions? Or can I just go ahead and make a motion and then, so when's the discussion? If somebody gets a second, they want to vote right away.
So if I were the mayor, this is the way I would handle an agenda item. I would say on the agenda next is agenda item 2. This agenda item is to have the city attorney present on Rosenberg's rules of order, as well as city council policy manuals and efficient meetings. Mr. City Attorney, would you please present me, or at this point, do any council members have any conflict of interest to disclose? Hearing none, moving on. Mr. City Attorney, would you please present? Then I would present, and then following my presentation, then if I were the mayor, I would say, do any council members have any clarifying or technical questions of the city attorney? And if a city council member decided that now is the point where they wanted to say that they were having, I want to discuss this, I would declare that council member out of order them to yield and say, you may only address technical or clarifying questions. This is not
Okay.
the point for discussion. Then I would address that council member's concerns as the city attorney. And then after that would happen, I would say, as the mayor, I would say, I am now willing to entertain any motions. And then somebody would say, I have a motion to do this, second, and then they try to get into a conversation, let's say. And my response would be like, we're not there yet. You're out of order. Are there any other motions to decide? And then let's say we get 2 motions with seconds. Then I would say, okay, we now have 2 seconded motions. It is time for council member discussion. We are going to start with motion number 2, which is this. Discuss amongst yourselves or this and that. And then and in order to focus it, I might say, you know, Mayor Pro Tem Martinez, you made motion number 2. Would you care to start us off? And then now would be the time for discussion. And it's important to note, I would focus the conversation, if I were the mayor, only on motion number 2, because that's the first vote we have to take. If motion number 2 passes, we don't need to talk about motion number 1.
But isn't that
'Cause
kind of
usually-
messed up? Because like, what if there was like a possibility that if there was a discussion on the second one, that one would have like passed, or if that one went first before going second, you know what I mean?
But see, typically the motions that are made second or third, if you pay attention to them, what they do is they obviate the first motion. So I move for XYZ, okay? I move XYZ with this caveat. Well, the second motion, if it comes with that caveat, why are we even voting on the first motion that doesn't include it? That's certainly not the council's direction. By handling the prior motion after we vote on the later motion, what happens is we have the capacity then to have multiple conflicting orders from the council, and then at that point, which one do we follow?
Kevin?
Okay, so first, sorry, my bad.
No, you continue on, Councilman Martinez. I'll ask afterward.
Okay, so first, we get to say, we basically ask questions, clarifying anything that we didn't understand, then motions, then we have the discussions in order of the motions.
Right.
Okay,
And
how
so
is that
when we
different than trying to put things on the agenda at the end of the meeting?
The agenda at the end of the meeting, I'll talk about that in a little bit, but the main reason why there can't be discussion as to agenda items or future agenda items is because nothing that is being brought up by the city council members is actually written on the agenda. The public has been provided no notice.
So basically, hey, I want this on the agenda. Who wants it? If you get a second, boom, vote, yes, good to go.
Then vote. But see, if we end up having a conversation at that point, what we haven't done, we haven't told the public we're having that conversation, which means we're now in a Brown Act violation. So which is why I had trouble coming up with a hypothetical here, because theoretically, if we start talking about something, but it's actually something the city has the power to do, it's not present on this agenda and we'd be in violation of the Brown Act.
All right. I think I got it, Kevin.
All right. Anyone else?
Yeah, the question I had is, so you have the initial motion and then you have the second motion that's made and seconded.
Right.
What happens if the second motion has no direct connection with the first motion? Like, it's not an amendment to the motion. It's like, it may be a motion germane to the subject matter, but it's, doesn't have that connection.
What that tells me, without being able to talk about specifics, is that the council hasn't really narrowed their focus. Because if we're asking you to approve a contract and you've made two motions that are both seconded that can both be voted on, I can't even imagine what those two motions would be, because it seems quite clear that the council hasn't focused the motion. The discussion, like in most of our agenda items, it's usually something to the effect of council review this list and prioritize it, or council approve a contract with this group, or council approve this development agreement or this ordinance or something like that. And so typically what happens is any motion on something like that, it's almost necessary that any follow-up motions would necessarily deal with the first. I've actually never seen it where multiple motions could stand despite all coming subsequent to one another. I imagine it's possible, and if that were the case, what I would recommend in that circumstance is that council start using the process of friendly amendments to try to clean up some of the discussion, so that the motions can be very focused on what exactly it is that we're doing.
Now, I just saw in one of the other committee meetings that I went to, they made a motion and they approved, they made a motion and they seconded a second motion, but then they had, also they had to go back to the first motion and officially vote on that, even though, the second motion pretty well stated where they were going. They still had to go back to the first motion and actually do a formal vote on that. But you're saying that that's not necessary.
Usually that's not what happens, because usually any subsequent motions, so if I say motion A, motion B, and motion C without getting into specifics, usually motion A is a motion to do one thing, motion B is a motion to do exactly the other, and motion C is a modification of those two. So if you approve motion C, well, obviously you're doing part of motion A and motion B.
Right.
So if you were to vote on motion A and motion B, then you would have inconsistent votes. And then what is it we're actually doing? Because staff would have no idea.
So what I'm just saying, as procedure, once motion C is voted on in approval of motion C, I don't have to go back to 2 and 1 and officially have those voted on, be it negatively or whatever.
Right, and that's usually because motions 1 and 2 or A and B have been taken care of by the adoption of motion C.
Okay.
And it's just usually how it plays out. I don't believe I've ever seen it the other way, but I'm sure there are unique circumstances where maybe 2 motions are required to handle the agenda item. If that's the case, by all means, ask me and I'll do my best to sort it out.
I will ask you to do that if it happens.
And so this gets us to basically our 3 basic
Okay,
motions.
I'm sorry.
Oh, no, go right ahead.
We have Councilman Gama who had a question.
Of course.
Yes, I just wanted to make a comment because I was trying to come up with an example. Like, let's say there's a motion to vote yes, and there's a motion to vote no. Now, conceivably, both of them could get a second, but if either one is either approved 3-2, then it's over with, right?
Exactly.
Okay.
You can't have an approval of a yes and a no, otherwise nobody has any idea what's going on.
So that's why it's all makes sense to me now, because that's why having 3 motions is the limit.
Right, because you typically have yes, no, or let's do something else entirely.
Okay, that's a really good way to frame this up, because it totally makes sense now. Because if there's 2 motions on the floor, one for yes, one for no, and you act on one of them that gets a majority vote, it's over.
Yeah, and we'll see that in this next slide with the different types of motions. Is there anybody else who has anything?
It appears not, so you can move on.
So when we look at our 3 basic motions, the basic motion is I move that we adopt staff's recommendation to give $50,000 to XYZ, right? It's straightforward. We know what we're doing. We're giving $50,000 to XYZ, whatever that is. Okay. Motion number 2 might be I move that we approve payment of $25,000 to XYZ. I think $50,000 is excessive. Okay. Well, if we stop there, once we approve motion B, $25,000, obviously there's no reason to talk about 50 because we didn't approve that. We approved 25. If somebody wanted to approve $50,000, then the option should have been to vote no on motion B and have motion B fail. But let's say we're entertaining all 3 motions. So first motion, $50,000 to XYZ. Motion to amend, I move that we approve payment of $25,000 to XYZ. And the substitute motion is, you know what? I don't like XYZ. Let's disband them. Let's get rid of that whole thing. Well, if we vote on getting rid of XYZ, I don't see why there's any reason to give any of them money. And so, or let's terminate our contract with XYZ, or let's do something like that. And that kind of sums up how the 3 motions handle. And so if you intend to give $50,000 to XYZ as a council member, obviously you can't vote for motions B or C. If they pass, well, then we know that you would have found yourself in the minority vote anyway. And so the city's accomplished its business. During the discussion phase, hey, I really think XYZ is a really great organization and provides a really great service, and we should really give them $50,000. You've had the opportunity to be heard. If others agree with you, then we go back to motion A because motion B and motion C will fail. And so the other thing is to address some of the other comments that took place when we were kind of hashing out how to deal with the emotions. When we're dealing with a motion to amend, it's important to consider friendly amendments. And that is when a motion is made and before a motion is seconded or something like that, if you have something that you think would work better, by all means, gain the recognition of the chair and say something like, I really like that motion, but what if we made it $25,000 instead of $50,000? And if the person who makes the motion goes, yeah, I'm acceptable with that, well, then you have your second and motion for $50,000 is off the table. It saves a lot of time and can sometimes save a lot of debate if a friendly amendment is possible. If it's not, we still have the ability to make an amended motion with a second or a substitute motion that does away with both of them with a second, and we still handle it in the same basic way. Before I move on to special motions, does anybody have any questions about the 3 basic motion types? All right, hearing none. So I've put a number of motions as what I call special motions, and this is because certain motions are not subject to debate under our policy manual as well as Rosenberg's rules. They're simply straight up or down votes. And other motions are subject to a supermajority requirement, which means a 2/3 vote. Sometimes these, I haven't included the ones under state law, there are certain statutory requirements with respect to certain motions under state law. So, for example, the adoption of a special tax requires a supermajority vote of not only the council as well as 66% of the voters. Certain payment obligations and things of that nature require 2/3 votes by law, but there are other more other types of motions that do that as well. But focusing first on motions not subject to debate. And these motions are the motion to adjourn the meeting, motion to recess, motion to fix the time to adjourn, motion for an agenda item, which is part of our policy manual. And the reason specifically for that one is because we're avoiding Brown Act violations. The motion to table, and a motion to limit debate. So I'll explain kind of similarly how some of these things, you'll see there's overlap with supermajority requirements, and that's motion to limit debate, motion to close nomination, well, motion to limit debate, and maybe not motion to table. But typically the reason why we don't have these things subject to debate is because a lot of these things deal with points of privilege and not necessarily points of order. So for example, I move that we recess for 5 minutes. Basically, let's take a 5-minute break. There's no real need to debate that, and somebody might have personal issues that they might want to attend to. So for example, restroom breaks or things of that nature. It doesn't really subject itself to debate because we could just adjourn for 5 minutes or recess for 5 minutes and be done with it and move on. And the question is these motions still require a majority vote. So if one council member said, I move for a 5-minute recess, and then you hear somebody go seconded, and then a majority vote, well, then it's done. There's no reason to debate these motions. Same with motions to adjourn and motions to fix the time. And this all is subject to the majority vote requirement. And this is really the embodiment of the majority does truly rule. So if you get 3 votes, it doesn't matter what the majority thinks on this. If it's time to adjourn, it's time to adjourn. Motions to table and limit debate. The ones that require supermajority requirements, like motion to limit debate, motion to close nominations, motion to object to consideration of a question. That motion is really about, I move that we not even consider this agenda item. We don't discuss it. We don't do anything with respect to it. We're done with it. I don't even want to look at this. And motion to suspend the rules. The reason why these motions require 2/3 votes is because it's an exercise of force by the majority against the minority. So for example, when 2 council members, let's say, are let's say holding up the works because they're holding on vehemently to something they're passionate about, and remaining council members are frustrated by the fact that this is still being discussed, you could move to call the question or motion to limit debate and say, all right, that's it, we're done discussing this. But because what you're doing is you're forcing at least 2 council members or 1 council member to stop talking, there's something that doesn't seem fair about that. There's something that kind of offends our sense of fairness and courteousness and things like that. So in essence, in order to do that, it needs to be a 4-2. It needs to be a 4-1 vote. 3-2 won't cut it. So if we're going to shut down somebody in the minority position, it really needs to be a supermajority of the council for fairness. There has to be no question as to whether or not the person in the minority position is just being silenced. And so that's really the reason for some of these non-debate rules and non-majority rules, is because what they really are is an exercise of force by the majority against the minority. And so you don't see them used too much, but when they are used, it's usually because at least one person is being difficult. And the rest of the council basically, or the rest of the board or council or whatever legislative body it is adhering to this rule, is basically frustrated by it and they want to shut down conversation. And it's within their power to do it because majority rules, but it requires a supermajority because we're concerned with minority members' rights. And so, you know, does anybody have any questions with respect to these? They don't come up very frequently.
Yes, I do.
Councilman Gama.
I would like to make a motion to fix the time to adjourn this meeting at 6:30 p.m.
Is there a second?
Oh, it doesn't sound like it. I just thought I would try that.
Motion fails for lack of a second.
Kevin, I had a question.
Absolutely.
Okay, so when we're moving to call or to quit debate, who makes that motion? And do we let's say some particular councilman has a long statement on a particular position, and it's going 2 minutes, 3 minutes, 4 minutes, whatever. And another councilman wants to call the question or limit debate.
Okay.
I mean, does the mayor then have the right to say to the person who's having this, making this statement, yeah, I don't know, out of order sounds bad, but
To end the filibuster, so to speak?
yeah, thank you, Councilman X, for your thoughts. Well, first of all, unless as the mayor, I would call the question. Does the mayor call the question, or in fact, do I have to wait for another councilman to call the question?
Any council member may make the motion to call the question. What typically happens after that is the mayor will seek a second, and all discussion will cease. Any council member who refrains from or who doesn't cease should be declared out of order.
So, but I guess the sensitivity is, when would the mayor or one of the other council people make that call if that other councilman is like in midstream with their conversation?
Well, this is the problem with balancing courtesy and collegiality with also the enforcement duties of the chair. Being a chair requires a flexible but sometimes firm hand, and that is, it would be the mayor or chair's responsibility to enforce the rules. There is also a motion that's not listed here where other members could make a motion requiring the chair to enforce the rules. And that can be passed by a majority vote. And so the thing is that same with motion to suspend the rules. If somebody wanted to suspend the rules, so to speak, so that they could do things they wouldn't otherwise be allowed to do, this gets problematic in the government venue because we're subject to other laws. But in essence, everybody relies on the mayor to maintain order in the meeting. If one council member is defying the mayor or will not bring themselves to yield, then we've lost control. There's no order. Mayor should declare that person out of order. We should take a vote. And the main reason here, when this comes up on like a motion to call the question or something of that nature, when this comes up, it's important to keep in mind what the supermajority requirement is really about. And it's about, you need 4-1 to pass it. So if a council member who's continually talking and wants to continue talking, and the mayor says, hey, we have a motion to call the question. Is there a second? There's a second. And then 4 council members say, yay. Well, then we're not really concerned about being that nice anymore, because the fact of the matter is that you have 4 of 5 telling one person, hey, that's enough.
So either the mayor or any particular council person can make that motion in midstream of a person making their conversation?
Yes, they can.
Like I'm going on for 5 or 10 minutes. Let's say I'm a council person. I'm going on for 5 or 10 minutes, and the mayor sees that we're all that person's rambling on, or he perceives that they're rambling on.
Now,
he can or she can stop by calling the question, or can anybody else do that in midstream? Stop that conversation in midstream.
it's important that the council members, before they interrupt, gain the recognition of the chair. So if I were a council member who wanted to make a motion to call the question, I would seek to gain recognition of the chair by putting my hand up or something like that. And the question would also be, is that if a council member was, let's say, going on for 15 minutes, well, the chair has the authority on, the mayor has the authority on his or her own to remind the council member of the 5-minute restriction and say, I'll give you another minute to wrap up your thoughts, but wrap it up.
Okay.
You know, otherwise I will declare you out of order and this and that. And, you know, like I said, it's a difficult balance. We want to make sure people get the opportunity to be heard, but the opportunity to be heard does also not allow one person to hold 4 other members hostage for 20 minutes. And so that's kind of why, once again, that's why we have the 2/3 vote requirement, is because there is a recognition here that what we are doing when we go down this road is we are basically telling one person to quiet down.
So,
And
so-
once we go down that road, we're no longer as nice as we otherwise could be.
So to us, I mean, it could be before that 5 minutes that the question could be made, or do we have a requirement to allow the council person to speak for 5 minutes?
It's entirely up to the chair. My recommendation would be that our council policy manual recommends 5 minutes. If I were the chair, I would say, I'll give you have 3 minutes remaining or 1 minute remaining. And then after that, you're going to wrap it up.
And can I request that the city clerk have a timer or something so that the mayor doesn't have to keep track of 5 minutes as well as
Yes.
listen to the conversation?
You absolutely may. That's entirely up to the
Okay.
mayor or the parliamentarian.
Okay,
And so certain mayors have handled things differently. I believe former mayors haven't had time limits. They didn't believe in them. Other mayors have been strictly adherent to it. And so it's all personal preference and what works for the city.
okay.
All right. Anything else? All right. Moving on. So another special motion, and this one comes up periodically, is the motion to reconsider. The motion to reconsider has some interesting provisions in it. It only applies when 2 requirements are met. And for cities, there's another special requirement based on the fact that, or the first requirement is all the more important based on the Brown Act. So a motion to reconsider an agenda item, which has already been voted upon, presents certain unique considerations. So let's say we have agenda item 1 and it passes yes with a 3-2 vote. First, the motion to reconsider has to be made at the same meeting. Okay, so if we're going to reconsider an agenda item, you cannot wait until the next city council meeting. The reason for this is twofold. One is we need everything to be fresh in the council's minds as to why the motion to reconsider should happen. What was the mistake in the vote? Why would you change your vote? We just discussed this, let's do it. The other reason is because the Brown Act requires it. If we wait till the next meeting, that item will not be on the agenda. We cannot bring it up. We can't discuss it. We can't vote on it. And so as a result, the first requirement is any motion to reconsider must be made at the same meeting that the vote was taken. A motion made at a later meeting would be untimely and should be ruled against. As I said here, non-governmental agencies may suspend these rules to consider such a motion. On a motion to suspend the rules, the city can't do so without violating the Brown Act. And so we're stuck with requirement number 1. Requirement number 2 is also interesting in that it can only be made by a member who voted with the majority. So if we were moving to reconsider an agenda item where it was 3-2 yes, only one of the people who voted yes could move for reconsideration. The people who voted no would not be allowed to make such a motion because otherwise the council could find itself harassed by 2 people who don't have the power to change the vote anyway, but they could continually hold up and use procedure to bog down the meeting. And so it's really about when the change of vote would change the outcome of the decision. And so that's why it has to be done in the same meeting, and it has to be brought by a member who was in the majority who now seeks to change his or her vote. And so this is, as I've got a note here, this is in conformity with the idea that majority rules while respecting the rights of the minority. The minority, if you're on the number 2 side of the 3-2 vote, you've been heard. Calling to reconsider it, as long as the other members in the majority aren't willing to change their vote, doesn't do anything. All it does is waste time and bog down the process. However, if you on the 3-2 side and you voted yes, and you're in the number 3, your change of vote changes policy. And so it's important that we give effect to what the majority's actual will is. And so that one comes up from time to time when people either didn't understand the agenda item, they didn't understand the repercussions of such a vote, or they've simply changed their mind while thinking about it after the agenda item is passed. But like I said, it has to be done in the same meeting and can only be done by a person who voted with the majority on that item. Otherwise, given in our city perspective, the next available option is if another meeting has passed then that person would have to bring it up as a motion for a new agenda item. And in doing so, we run into some problems with doing that. Theoretically, it's possible you could have it as a new agenda item and undo the last decision made. But there's something that's a little bit hinky about that, in that a lot of the time there's a public policy in favor of finality of decision making. And so such an action wouldn't be illegal. It just wouldn't be a great idea if every single time the city council took action, we had to wait 2 more meetings to figure out whether or not that's really the action. It puts a delay in things. It lends an air of uncertainty to governmental decision making that we tend to disfavor and not like. But like I said, these things happen rarely. When they do happen, I think it's very important that it has to happen in the same meeting, and it has to be done by the person in the majority. Do we have any comments on that one?
Councilwoman Perez.
Okay, yes. So I just want to clarify. The only person who can bring a motion to reconsider an agenda item, say, motion to have ice cream on Fridays. I voted yes, got 3-2 yeses, motion passes. Only the people that voted yes in the majority can do a motion to reconsider, not someone who is a loser of the motion, correct?
Right, exactly. Because otherwise what would happen is, if you really didn't like what the majority said, you could just continually make the motion every 5 minutes and get the other person to second it. And then you're back in a discussion on the same thing that's already been handled 3 or 4 times. And you could really use it to harass the majority if you wanted to, and bully people into changing their mind. And so that's the reason why there's that rule where it says, hey, if you're on the minority side of this, you don't get majority will's been imposed, you're done.
Kevin.
Sure.
Kevin, I had a question. Let's say there's an agenda item that got voted on, and then somewhere down the line, someone requests to have that agenda item brought up again, but there were modifications to the original agenda item, or it's the same subject, but the conditions changed.
Right. And you're talking about in the context of a motion to have a future agenda item.
Okay, yeah, let's take this ice cream one. I like that one. Okay, so we voted yes on ice cream, and later on, but part of that was we voted yes on ice cream, but it's going to be free to everybody. And then later on, we decide, hey, this is costing us a lot of money, and 3 or 4 council down the line, we request for a council agenda item that we provide free ice cream. We provide ice cream, but we're now going to charge 10 cents or whatever.
Right.
So is that something that, it's the same subject matter,
but technically not a motion to reconsider. Because otherwise, if it were a motion to reconsider, what we're really talking about is just changing the vote on that motion.
Right.
When we're going into a new discussion and we're talking about augmenting a policy that already exists. So for example, like the ice cream social, we're now going to charge 25 cents. If you think about what government does, that's really what we do in general, is we make a policy and then later on we evaluate it and determine whether or not we want to make changes to it or get rid of it. And so otherwise what would happen is future councils would be hamstringed by actions of old councils saying, well, we can't change it now. It's free forever. The law certainly wouldn't condone such a result, but there is some problem with having it go back and forth every council meeting. And that's where I talk about how generally public policy favors a final decision. We don't want to forever be in limbo as to what the requirements are. Are we charging 25 cents for an ice cream cone, or are we not? Every 2 weeks, it seems to change. And so there really should be, when we're doing these things, we really should be mindful of the longevity of this and what final action is. And that's why really when you're talking about motions to reconsider, we're talking about people who change their mind during the meeting. They just have a change of heart and they want to change from a yes to a no vote. They don't want to usually reopen the entire thing to discussion with new ideas. Once we do that, it's really not a motion to reconsider. It's more of a new agenda item. And even if we address it in the same meeting, we can reopen that item and hash out all those conversations in real time in the real meeting, because it's still on the agenda. We don't run into any Brown Act problems, but it is a big waste of time. I mean, it commits valuable time and resources, especially if the agenda item is packed. And so when we're looking at motion to reconsider, while it is theoretically possible to rehash the entire conversation, that's not usually the appropriate use of it. It's usually when somebody just wants to change their vote.
But you're mentioning with the ice cream thing, if like it's kind of a completely new agenda item, that's an adjustment, you know, for whatever reason, the council says, you know, this was a good idea now, but then 3 months later or whatever, we thought maybe it wasn't a good, or some councilmen have, I think, want to reconsider it. They want,
Right.
They like the motion, but they want to reconsider like the conditions of the motion, I guess.
Right, and that happens fairly frequently with government policies. We have an idea and then we put forth this idea and then we go, oh, that needs some tweaking. It didn't work as we intended it to.
Okay.
And so that's kind of normal, and that's one of the things that we adjust frequently at future agenda items when things don't work as planned, or you know they have unintended consequences that we hadn't considered.
Okay. Thank you.
You're welcome. Anyone else? All right. So now we're getting into courtesy and decorum, and this has kind of been the overarching theme of this: is that we really have a balance with Rosenberg's rules. We need to conduct efficient meetings. We need to accomplish the city's business. We need to do so without, you know, being jerks to each other. And we need to make sure that the minority voters or the minority group is able to speak and be heard and have some meaningful interaction in the process, as well as the members of the public. If it's always 4 people shutting down one person or 3 people shutting down 2, that meetings, you know, generally there's a lot of animosity on a council like that. If people can't have a germane discussions and just have differences of opinions, that tends not to work out so well. And so really what these rules do is they're meant to foster focused, efficient meetings where everybody can have a meaningful opportunity to participate. And so that, you know, this requires that discussion and comments be germane and relevant to the subject matter. And we discussed how I like it more when it's germane to the actual motion, because the motion provides us a destination. It's an outcome. So what we're discussing is we're discussing why that outcome is good or bad, or why it will or will not work. And once we have that guidepost or that port, we know which way we're sailing. We know which direction we're going, and we're not all over the place. I find that it really, really helps focus conversation. It also requires, in order to foster this kind of conversation, this kind of atmosphere, it's important that other council members are mindful of the mayor's authority as parliamentarian, and that requires everyone to yield and to refrain from interrupting and refrain from talking over each other and just sit down, wait till we're recognized, say our piece, listen to what other council members have to say without becoming impassioned, even though sometimes it's difficult. And by fostering that atmosphere, we can actually have a conversation and figure out what's best for the city and what's best for the public that has chosen each of you to represent them. Interruptions are possible, and there are certain times where interruptions are actually required. So like points of order, points of privilege and whatnot. For those of you who don't know, a point of order is when somebody is pointing out that the rules are being violated. That allows you to interrupt and say, you know, Mayor, point of order, you know, so-and-so has been talking for 15 minutes. Please enforce the rules. And that's allowed to be interrupted. And then the mayor can then say, hey, listen, the rules are this. I'm going to require you to wrap it up in a minute. We'll give you a minute to finish your piece, and then we got to move this along. Point of privilege are generally general or personal privileges. So for example, a point of general privilege would be something like, I find the temperature in this room to be very cold. Could we increase the temperature by 2 degrees so that everybody can feel more comfortable? Typically, or a point of personal privileges is I can't hear what this person is saying. Can we adjust the mic, or can you please speak up, sir? Or those things that are somewhat integral to the proper functioning and atmosphere of the meeting. You can also interrupt for appeals, calls for orders of the day, withdraw a motion. Generally, interruptions are disfavored, but there are mechanisms for doing it. Like I said, the most poignant ones are points of order and points of privilege. In addition, one of the best ways to foster a collegial kind of environment is that it's important to remember that we're not really debating with each other. We are, but we're doing it through an intermediary. And one of the ways that's accomplished is that all comments should be really directed towards the mayor or the chair. And say, instead of, I don't like this person's ideas on this or this and that, and say, Mayor Rollins, I believe what would be best for the city is if we do something like this and this and that. We all have a conversation, but we do it through a conversation with the mayor. It tends to depersonalize things and de-escalate heated conversations. Also, members of the public, when making public comments, should also address the mayor. They should not address individual council members or the city manager or the city clerk. That would be inappropriate. And so in the past and in other agencies, there would be an admonishment that you will direct all of your communications to the mayor and the mayor alone, and that's it. And that's typically the way that goes in order to enforce kind of this collegial, friendly, courteous atmosphere and maintain some decorum. Does anybody have any questions on that before we move on to council policies?
Let me finish writing my notes. One more minute.
Okay. And I can send you guys all of these slides as well when I send out that AB 1234 training packet.
Okay.
All right, 4 more slides. I'll try and be quick. So we spoke a lot about council policies and procedures manual. A lot of what's in that manual are things that are taken directly from the AB 1234 training. Lots of things on conflict of interest, when to recuse yourself. And so it would be duplicative to get into the majority of that now after we've had so much of it as it relates to the Political Reform Act and whatnot. There are a few things that I've pulled out that I like from the council policies and procedures manual that I think can help lead to efficient meetings and can kind of help with this idea of courtesy and decorum that we've been in this overarching kind of gestalt, if you will. And that is, it's important to remember what the nature of a municipal corporation is. And we use the term in law, we use municipal corporation. I know it's a government, but it's really a corporation. It's really, the city council is the board of directors. Same as it is for like Microsoft, same as it is for any corporation. The city attorney is general counsel for that corporation. The city manager functions in a city manager council form of government, functions as the chief executive officer. Each of the subordinate officers are like the chief financial officer, the chief operations officer, and whatnot. And so if we think about it in terms of corporate governance, it makes a little bit more sense as to how all of this works and what the interplay and responsibility is for people. And so just as corporate board members have no authority in the daily operation of a corporation or the management of employees, so too the city council has no real role in managing day-to-day operations or in engaging in personnel matters or in just really the general operations of the city. That is all delegated to the chief executive officer. If we look at what executive means and its root word, the chief executive is to execute. What is it that the executive is supposed to execute? They are supposed to execute the will and policies of the council, the majority of the council. And so the council's job is to give city policies and general direction as to city governance. And so where it is it's not so much bogged down in day-to-day activities, it's bigger picture, much bigger picture. So what does the council want to do with respect to this issue? You know what, like if we use like Steve Jobs and Apple as an example, I don't think they told them what color they wanted the iPhone to be. But what they said is, hey, you have 6 months before you unleash something at the Worldwide Developers Conference, and you better friggin' wow us, or you'll be looking for a new job. And it was more bigger picture type of stuff. we want something that is between a laptop and an iPhone. We think that there's some market there that you're not exploiting. Behold, they leave it up to Steve Jobs and we end up with the iPad. And so really it's bigger picture type things that the council should be involved in, and broader policy. And then we give it to city executive to execute. This is your job. You run the day-to-day. You allocate the resources to it. You determine the manpower. Just get it done. And that's essentially what the city executive branch does. My role is a little bit different, but like I said, it's very much like general counsel to a corporation, except I don't have shareholders to whom I'm responsible. I report directly to the council, but my client is the organization itself. And so I am responsible for regulatory oversight, reporting to the council, assisting the chief executive in actually executing policy and bringing forth some of these things, reviewing contracts and regulatory compliance mainly. And so that's really kind of how this is organized. And if we think about this as a corporation, it will make a little bit more sense as to how it operates. And then once again, it's important to recognize that because we are kind of like a board and a chief executive officer in our organization, council manager organization, that decisions of the majority of the council are binding on not only the chief executives and the city as far as policy, but they are binding on the rest of the council as well. And so when a majority of the council has spoken, that is it. Council members who find themselves in the minority vote, that's it. They don't influence policy. They don't get to run to a department head and say, hey, I want this done. That's not how this works, and it creates problems. And so if we step back and we say, okay, this is the policy, this is what the city council wants done, execute and get it done, then the people over whom the council does have authority, myself, the city manager, we can then be held accountable for either doing what we were supposed to do, not doing what we were supposed to do, or changing the way it was done. And we are directly responsible to the city council for that. And so I think that's probably the best way to think about it, and why you'll hear us talk about municipal corporations quite a bit. And so this brings us to what are the council's obligations with respect to meetings, with respect to city council meetings. And this is taken directly from our policy and procedures manual, and that is that city council members should prepare in advance for city council meetings. I know it's tough when you get an agenda 72 hours before a meeting and you have a weekend to basically read through voluminous documents on technical matters that may or may not be in your wheelhouse or area of expertise. But if we start preparing for meetings, and it's expected that council shall have read the agenda and the supporting documents prior to the meeting, whenever possible, council members should contact the city manager to resolve questions in advance of the meeting, or to give staff the opportunity to respond to that council member's questions publicly. This is all to the goal of avoiding unfair surprise, which doesn't really help anybody and detracts from the efficiency of the meeting. If myself, or let's say the director of public works or the director of community development, knows that there's a problem with something coming up on the agenda, or knows that two council members might have an issue with something, we can do the research and front load it so that we are adequately prepared to answer those questions at that time. If we don't know and it takes us by surprise, typically the answer is, I'll have to look into that and get back to you, which basically just puts things off to another meeting. And so I know it's a big ask, and I know that the agenda packets are not light reading, but the more preparation we do for the meeting and front load the questions with the meeting, the more efficient and smoothly the meeting goes with minimal interruptions or distractions.
Okay.
Which brings us to the council's code of conduct during the meetings. Generally, e-communication is prohibited unless there is an emergency or during remote meetings. We have a provision in the council policies and manual that when we're remote, we can use cell phones, we can use digital electronic devices for communication and whatnot. I have here, however, keep in mind public hearings. The reason I have this here is because council is required during a public hearing or a quasi-judicial matter to make all of their decisions based on the evidence present in the record. And so if a council member is looking at something on a cell phone that is providing that person information, like let's say they're doing their own research, during a public hearing, The other members of the council have not been given opportunity to see it. The person against whom or in favor of whom the law is being applied does not have adequate opportunity to hear or respond to it, and that becomes due process violations. And so this can get us into a lot of trouble when it comes up on an administrative writ, because the council is required to base its final decisions on substantial evidence appearing in the record. And so typically it's disfavored or illegal during a public hearing to look at any outside materials or consider them. Now, if you've found outside materials, we can make them public in advance of the hearing so that then they become part of the record. But it's just really one of those kind of evidentiary things that needs to be considered. In addition, during public hearings, council members should not leave their seats or turn off their cameras. In quasi-judicial hearings, the reason for this is because those people have significant due process rights before the city. They have an opportunity to be heard. If the council members get up and leave, it's fairly easy to argue that their procedural due process rights have been violated. In addition, it's inappropriate to pack the audience for a specific agenda item or a public comment. Sometimes this happens with other cities. I've seen it happen before when there's 30 people that all show up at the behest of one council member to basically make a big stink about something. I haven't seen it much with us. It's just something to be mindful of, especially if we're looking at time constraints and we're looking at efficiency of meetings. There's nothing illegal about it. It's just generally not seen to be in good form. This brings us to council member responsibilities to the public. The mayor and other council members shall adhere to the opinions and policies set by the majority of the council when speaking as a city representative and or on behalf of the council. So when speaking in an official capacity, the only opinion or viewpoint that should be put forth is the opinion or viewpoint adopted by the majority of the council. We are speaking on behalf of the organization, and the organization only speaks when a majority of the council gives its voice to something. Otherwise, council members may speak as individuals as they do not forfeit their First Amendment rights. However, council members are required to make it expressly clear that their statements are personal and not made as representatives of the city. This also applies to city resources, uses of the city seal, letterhead, and titles. These also require permission to use. There's an entire ordinance regarding the use of the city seal and the city clerk's responsibilities with respect to the seal. There are also state laws that apply to use of city seal, as well as things that we've seen with respect to city resources. So it's not that individual council members can't speak their mind or can't speak out on issues that are near and dear to their hearts. It's just that when doing so, they have to make it clear that they are not speaking on behalf of the city. If chosen to speak on behalf of the city, it's kind of that toe the party line kind of idea, is that the council is unified. This is the council's goal. And this is the statement that the city itself is putting forward.
I had a question.
For sure.
And this may be a little bit softer, but a member of the public, say a student is applying for a college, and I want to give them a recommendation. Can I give them a recommendation as a city, a city council person?
You may state that your name is Rich Rollins and that you are currently serving as the mayor, but you are making this recommendation in your individual capacity. The city itself is not recommending this person for college.
So I can request from you the proper wording.
Right. And like I said, you can't say basically the inference can't be that the city is supporting this person's application for college. It's that you, who happen to be the mayor of the city, are supporting it.
Okay.
And so, like I said, you don't lose anything by virtue of public service. You don't lose your ability to speak. It's just, we have to be more clear as to who is speaking. We each wear many different hats, and sometimes those hats require us to speak something that we probably don't believe in or might not believe in, but we're required to anyway because of the civic duty imposed upon us.
Okay, thank you.
Does anybody else have anything? All right, which brings me to council city manager relations. And so this one kind of, sometimes it's a bit annoying for council members. I get it. Council members should avoid direct communications with city staff, just in general. All communication should be made through the city manager, who has the authority to direct, supervise, and or discipline the administrative staff. That is pursuant to our city charter. That is also pursuant to our municipal code. The reason for this is that direct communication with staff has the tendency to influence or pressure staff into accommodating or prioritizing individual council members' priorities. In addition, those individual council members' priorities may not be the same priorities the council has set. So remember, the only valid direction from the city council is the one that the majority of city council members voted for. And so if direction comes from a council member that is not in accordance with majority vote, it is not valid. And individual staff members not having maybe the job security or the safety or the knowledge to say, hey, listen, this is inappropriate. I don't really want to do this. They may feel pressured by elected officials, even if it's not an elected official engaging in pressure. The presence of a titled officer can sometimes be off-putting enough and influence the way that person behaves or performs their job functions. And so that influence can detract from the organization's objectives. It can cause an individual to deviate from the work they're supposed to be doing in order to accommodate an individual council member, which could take away from the council's overall directives and might also subject that person to discipline because the city manager has not been made aware of that person's being retasked, or why isn't this getting done, or what is going on here. And there's also a significant level of job stress that happens when you serve more than one master and are subject to conflicting orders. When that happens, that's usually where we start to see complaints like hostile work environment come up, is my job duties are unclear and I answer to too many people and I don't know what to do and it's causing me stress. And so it's cleaner for everyone if the city manager directs staff. The city council directs the city manager, who then goes and deals with the administrative staff in the proper manner. And then that way, everybody in the administrative staff knows city manager is the boss, their direct report department head is the boss, and there's a clear chain of command, and that the people who are giving the orders are the ones with the actual authority to supervise or discipline them. Any complaints that have been brought to city council member or requests brought to a city council member should then be directed to the city manager and or city attorney as appropriate. The reason for this is that if individual staff members come to city council members under threat of anonymity or under anonymity and then have grievances or complaints or things like that, in essence, what they're doing is they're skirting the actual people who have the authority to deal with the situation, and the person who has the authority to intervene is not made aware of it. So I'm not saying that they shouldn't come to you. It would be better if they reported it up and gained whistleblower protection if necessary, which they may or may not get by coming to a council member because they've gone outside their chain of command. But the fact of the matter is that when a council member intervenes, it's imperative that that council member also come to the city manager and let the city manager know what's going on, so that the city manager is given the opportunity to rectify or correct the situation and avoid any hostile work environment or personnel labor issues that might arise. Not to mention that sometimes there can be public safety issues that can arise as a result of this, and it's important that the city have the ability to intervene and put a stop to something before it becomes a bigger problem. In addition, council members and staff should avoid criticizing each other publicly. So city managers shouldn't criticize city council members. City attorneys shouldn't criticize city council members publicly. City council members shouldn't criticize any staff members publicly. It's catty and it's beneath what people expect of their elected representatives and their appointed representatives. And city managers should keep the council directly apprised of significant community, organizational, and political developments. That is taken directly from our city council policy and procedures manual. So once again, we're balancing the council's need to be informed. The council should be informed, absolutely. And the city manager should likewise be informed about any information the council receives regarding the day-to-day operations of the city. And with that, I believe I am done.
I had just a little question on that, just kind of on semantics. So
Absolutely.
a city councilman here's information and they direct the city manager that we want you to take care individually, because unless we bring it back to the city council as an agenda item, say a minor issue or a medium issue, we see a problem there. Can you deal with it and can you report back to report back to the entire council? Can individual council people, if they have a concern, talk to the city manager and say, we've observed this particular thing. We want you to deal with it and we want you to come back to us as to how you've dealt with it. Or does this have to go up to a city council agenda item?
I would say that individual council members, if they learn something that the city manager has the authority to address, so let it be a personnel complaint or a public safety complaint or something like that, it should immediately be brought to the attention of the city manager. That is absolute. The other question is whether or not the city manager would then report it back to the council. That begs significant legal questions. One, depending on what personnel it is, and most personnel have confidentiality rights in their personnel records. And the city council, having no authority to supervise or hire or fire those people, really has no right to invade the confidentiality of those personnel records. In fact, they are not public records. And with respect to law enforcement, they would be subject to the PITCHES process. And so those records do have some confidentiality and privacy protections associated with them. So wholesale disclosure of whatever it is, be it an investigation or something like that, to the council would probably violate certain privacy restrictions as well as confidentiality laws. However,
so how would a councilman then feel that their thoughts have been valued?
An individual council member, the first thing we have to understand is that an individual council member may not give direction because it's the council's majority. So an individual council member bringing forth something to the city manager is the same thing as a member of the public bringing forth a complaint. And a member of the public bringing forth a complaint would not receive anything if it was protected, like let's say it was a personnel complaint or something like that. The personnel complaint would then be, the matter is being addressed, it is being handled. I cannot give you specifics as to how, and I cannot divulge what is happening at this point in time. Ultimately, it would come back to me for a legal determination as to what we can tell you. But it's important to recognize that I believe it's Government Code Section 6254, Subdivision F of the Public Records Act, and Article 1, Section 1 of the California Constitution gives significant privacy protections and confidentiality protections to employment personnel records. And then once again, we talked about the PITCHES motions with respect to law enforcement personnel records, which cannot even be subpoenaed. There has to be a PITCHES motion filed in the state of California. That being said,
I'm just thinking policy-wise, not general individuals. We want this particular area to be addressed in a timely manner, or we want this particular area to be addressed and ask for a report back on that. Does that have to go? And as an individual councilman, can any individual councilman ask that, or do we have to then bring it up as an agenda item to push the point?
Things that are general like that, like for example, let's say the solution was a reorganization of a particular department, or let's say it was a reassignment of something that wasn't individualized or something like that, and it related to a significant kind of city organization or policy that went into effect. That could be something that probably, unless the council had the authority to address it, which in the hypothetical, it's difficult to say, it probably wouldn't be an agenda item, but it could rise to the level of a for your information memo for all council members based on the fact that it would be an item of public concern and would be something of, significant organizational concerns that the city manager is obligated under a policy and procedures manual to share with and keep the council apprised of. And so while there might not be an action for the council to take, depending on the intervention required, It could be something that could be shared with the council as a for information only memorandum, provided no discussion takes place.
Okay.
But it would really be factually specific as to what type of information would be made available.
Okay,
And then once again, you also, as it relates to certain items committed by law to the discretion of the city manager, that is also something that would be subject to performance evaluations in the future as to whether or not things are deemed handled or how they were handled. But in a closed session, it would be very important to limit discussion of the actual item outside of city manager or other personnel performance.
okay. Well, thank you. That's all I would like to know about.
You're welcome. And
So,
I don't.
being that there are no other hands raised, are we at the completion of your presentation?
We are, and I need a lot of water.
So I will adjourn this meeting then.
Thank you,
Thank you
Kevin.
for-
Thank you so much
Thank you very much.
Thank
Thank
you,
for your
Kevin.
time. Christy?